Chapter 2681. Buzz tilde. While Li Jie was still in shock, the remaining hundreds of flying creatures spread their wings and flew toward the dozens of golden core practitioners with bloodshot eyes. Spirit swallowing bug. Suddenly, Qi Ming, who was scolded by Dazun, screamed hysterically as if he had lost his parent. What? These are spirit swallowing bugs. Heng Zhao and the others were shocked. Spirit swallowing bugs were strange insects from antiquity times and ranked second in the insect scripture. They were the nemesis of Taoism practitioners. How could these golden core practitioners not have heard of them? However, they had only heard of them, and almost none of them had seen them before. Impossible! Xiong Huasong shouted. Spirit swallowing bugs are half the size of a fist, and their fangs are very long, and their wings are faintly golden. These are the larvae of spirit swallowing bug. I've seen them in a damaged insect scripture when I was young. It's definitely true. Qi Ming's face was pale and he could no longer maintain his composure. He said desperately, "Quick, let's run for our lives. Even if they are larvae, they are definitely not something we golden core practitioners can resist. To deal with spirit swallowing bugs, we can only use heavenly thunder and other things that do not belong to the five element. This is the sword tomb, where thunder does not exist. Even if there are masters from the thunder-controlling sect, it will be useless. Even all our spells will be swallowed by the spirit-swallowing bugs. And if we use spells without restraint, we will feed the spirit-swallowing bugs with spiritual qi and attract more spirit-swallowing bugs. Unless a nascent soul master is here and feeds the spirit-swallowing bugs with spiritual qi." Qi Ming had already escaped far away, but his words could still be heard. Ah! Li Jie could not help but scream. His flying sword was the closest to the spirit-swallowing bugs, and there were already 3 of them on it. In just a few words, the spirit-swallowing bugs had already swallowed most of the sword light of the flying sword. The strangest thing was that the body of the flying sword did not change much, but there was no spiritual qi in it. It was no different from an ordinary piece of iron. This is LV Ruochang's killing move to kill us. Heng Zhao could not help but feel cold. He really did not expect LV Ruochang to be able to find hundreds of spirit-swallowing bugs. Even a golden core cultivator would not be able to escape from a dozen spirit-swallowing bugs. Let's go. Without hesitation, Heng Zhao hurriedly flew toward the gap between the spirit-swallowing bugs. Since Heng had already fled, how could Dazun and the others still remain in the air? Seeing the empty space, they prepared to flee. However, something happened that made Heng Zhao and the others' souls fly out of their bodies. The clumsy-looking spirit-swallowing bug flew very fast, like a dark light, and rushed to their front. He was not inferior to golden core cultivators like them. The strangest thing was that these hundreds of spirit-swallowing bugs did not fly to other Foundation Establishment stage disciples at all. Instead, they stared at all the gold core stage cultivators. Even if a dozen spirit-swallowing bugs flew to other places and prepared to attack the Foundation Establishment disciples, they only flew a few feet away and then quickly flew back. High up in the sky, the pagoda that the cultivators had overlooked was emitting a faint fluctuation. Spirit-swallowing bugs feed on the spiritual qi of heaven and earth. We are golden core cultivators, and our dantian contains the golden core, which is where the spiritual qi of heaven and earth is most concentrated. Isn't that the most delicious food in the eyes of the spirit-swallowing bugs? Qi Ming could not help but show off his knowledge, but he did not dare to stop at all. The golden core cultivators fled in panic. Although the Foundation Establishment stage disciples did not have to worry for the time being, how could they remain calm? Although most of them still maintained their formation, as a whole, they seemed to be in a state of complete defeat as they flew towards the west in a sorry state. But at this moment, 3 black lines suddenly streaked across the sky and landed right next to Qi Ming, blocking him in the middle. How is this possible? Qi Ming almost rubbed his eyes. These are just the larvae of the spirit-swallowing bugs. How do they know how to surround us? But how could the spirit-swallowing bugs answer his question? Before Qi Ming could fly again, the 3 spirit-swallowing bugs flew at the same time, and the black lines flashed and landed on Qi Ming's body. Oh no! Qi Ming was actually not slow, but he was actually surrounded by 3 spirit-swallowing bugs. He was really unlucky. Attack! Although Qiming did not dare to use powerful spells, at this moment, he did not hesitate to wave his hand and cast a Dharma incantation on the spirit-swallowing bugs. This golden core cultivator's confinement spell was very powerful. The spiritual chi within a foot of the spirit-swallowing bugs was slightly stagnant. Crack! The spirit-swallowing bugs opened their mouths slightly, and the fangs at the corners of their mouths that were not very sharp bit on the confinement spell. Immediately, the confinement spell was broken. Although Qiming was already mentally prepared, when he saw that the confinement spell was broken so easily by a flying bug, his expression changed instantly. However, before he could think further, the two spirit-swallowing bugs on his left and right had already begun to devour his protective light. Attack! Qiming continuously cast Dharma incantations, wanting to block the spirit-swallowing bugs. Unfortunately, before he could cast a Dharma incantation, his Dharma incantation was quickly devoured by the spirit-swallowing bugs and could only delay them a little. It's good that you can delay them. Qiming was slightly relieved. He hurriedly checked, wanting to escape from the siege of the three spirit-swallowing bugs again. Just as Qiming was checking, another black line flew quickly and quietly from behind him. Before he could react, it landed on his protective light. Creak! Creak! The spirit-swallowing bugs unceremoniously began to devour Qiming's protective golden light, which immediately began to flicker. Damn it! Qiming turned pale with fright. He clapped his hands, and a palm-sized scarf flew out from his storage bag. The scarf emitted a pink light, and after absorbing the spiritual chi of heaven and earth, it rapidly expanded and covered the spirit-swallowing bugs behind Qiming. Creak! A soft sound, which seemed to be made by the spirit-swallowing bugs, was immediately covered by the pink light. Thank goodness! Qiming had just heaved a sigh of relief when 4 more black lines flew quickly from elsewhere. Obviously, they were attracted by the pink light. Damn it! How could I forget? Qiming almost wanted to slap himself. The spirit-swallowing bugs like the light from the Dharma treasure. I clearly knew that, and I even reminded others. How could I be so foolish? Why did I release the Dharma treasure? One of the spirit-swallowing bugs landed on the Dharma treasure and devoured the light. The other 3 spirit-swallowing bugs rushed toward Qiming. Facing 6 spirit-swallowing bugs at once, Qiming was very flustered. He cast spells one after another. What made him feel cold was that the spirit-swallowing bug's speed of devouring spells was getting faster and faster. His confinement spell was almost instantly devoured by the spirit-swallowing bugs. I can't care anymore. Qiming saw that his scarf was about to be torn apart by 2 spirit-swallowing bugs. He gritted his teeth and rubbed his hands together. The Dharma power in his body surged, and a violent wave of Dharma power was generated from his hand. Kill! Qiming shouted and released his hands. With a roar, a bright light overflowed and covered the surrounding dozens of feet. A strong Dharma power rushed toward the 6 spirit-swallowing bugs. Chirp chirp tilde the 6 spirit-swallowing bugs cried out loudly as they were sent flying by Qiming's attack. They tumbled in the air. However, when the 6 spirit-swallowing bugs stopped in mid-air, they cried out and rushed toward Qiming again. It was as if the spell just now had no effect on them. Moreover, because of the light from Qiming's spell, another 3 spirit-swallowing bugs were attracted to him. This! Qiming almost cried. Then, he realized something. It must be Green Peak. What secret skill did he use? Let's go. Qiming hurriedly moved his body, wanting to escape. He had only flown 2 feet when the 9 spirit-swallowing bugs surrounded him. Even the 2 spirit-swallowing bugs that had devoured the scarf stuck their heads out of the scarf that had lost its light. They flapped their wings and flew toward Qiming. Qiming was anxious. He knew better than anyone how powerful the spirit-swallowing bugs were. However, he was the first to encounter so many spirit-swallowing bugs. He took out all kinds of yellow talismans and magic weapons from his storage bag and threw them at the spirit-swallowing bugs one by one, hoping for a miracle. However, none of these magic weapons that could control the spiritual chi of heaven and earth gave Qiming any hope. Qiming screamed. Just as the light around him flashed again and sent the 9 spirit-swallowing bugs flying, 2 of them actually got close to his protective light. They bit through Qi Ming's protective light and crashed into his body. Qi Ming's screams attracted the attention of many Golden Core practitioners who were fighting the spirit-swallowing bugs. They also attracted the attention of many Foundation establishment practitioners. The 9 spirit-swallowing bugs that had been sent flying by Qi Ming flapped their wings again and rushed toward Qi Ming. One of them was even attracted by the light from his spell and flew toward him. These 10 spirit-swallowing bugs all rushed toward Qi Ming's lower abdomen. His body was like a piece of paper and was easily penetrated by them. Qi Ming writhed madly in the air. He was in so much pain. Explode. Unable to bear the pain, Qi Ming made a spell and wanted to explode himself. However, when he made the spell, no Dharma power was produced in his meridians. The spirit-swallowing bugs had already rushed into his dantian and swallowed his golden core. At this moment, Qi Ming's Dharma power could no longer support the flying spell. His body fell from the sky and landed on the ground of the sword catacomb, a bloody mess. From his flesh, the spirit-swallowing bugs that were smaller than before flew out again. They were much faster and flew toward the other Golden Core practitioners. The Foundation establishment and Golden Core practitioners who had witnessed this scene all turned pale. A practitioner in the early stage of the Golden Core realm, who was already famous on the Dawnrain continent, was killed by a dozen little bug. If they had not seen it with their own eyes, how could they have believed it? At this moment, the sword hums that seemed to have subsided earlier once again rang out loudly. Amidst the sword lights of the cultivators several kilometers away, many swordsmen wearing pitch-black sword robes appeared. These swordsmen's heads and faces were all covered. -11. Chapter 2682. These swordsmen stood on the sword lights and flew high into the sky. Their eyes looked at the 160,000 cultivators who were fleeing in panic. They took out a flat object from their bosom and put it in their mouths. Then, they took out a pitch-black bag from their waist and opened it. A bunch of pitch-black flying objects also rushed out from the bag. The flying objects were the size of a fist and were in the shape of a gourd. They looked exactly like the spirit-swallowing bugs. These swordsmen puffed up their cheeks and seemed to be blowing sounds that couldn't be heard by human ears. Along with the sounds, the spirit-swallowing bugs flew in the air, covering the sky and the earth, and rushed toward the cultivators in a dense and overwhelming manner. So many spirit-swallowing bugs. Seeing so many spirit-swallowing bugs flying towards them, the cultivators of the True Path sect were scared out of their wits. They could not care less about their formation. They all covered their heads and ran away, afraid that the spirit-swallowing bugs would target them. Buzz 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 tilde within a few miles, the sound of the spirit-swallowing bugs spreading their wings could be heard. The entire battlefield was covered. Hold on, hold on. Li Zongbao flew in the air and shouted with all his might. However, the cultivators were already frightened by the spirit-swallowing bugs. How could they hold on? Senior brother Li, watch out! Xiao Maro shouted. A spirit-swallowing bug flew to Li Zongbao's back and rushed towards him. Although Li Zongbao was shocked, he still waved the immortal piercing whip in his hand and hit the spirit-swallowing bug. Senior brother, don't use your magic treasure. Fairy Hongxia was also shocked and shouted hurriedly. However, to their surprise, Li Zongbao's whip hit the spirit-swallowing bug and sent it flying back dozens of feet. It fell from the air and was dead. Hey! This doesn't seem to be a spirit-swallowing bug. Xiao Maro was also slightly shocked and hurriedly flew over. When he caught the spirit-swallowing bug with his hand, he saw that this spirit-swallowing bug was very similar to the previous one. However, there was a deep dent on its thumb-sized head. It must have been caused by Li Zongbao's immortal piercing whip. This spirit-swallowing bug. Fairy Hongxia quickly flew over and took a closer look. She could not tell. Fairy Hongxia had never seen an earth-devouring bug before. Naturally, she did not know that the earth-devouring bug was no different from the spirit-devouring bug. Humph, of course they are not spirit-swallowing bugs. Li Zongbao's voice came from behind them. If the sky is filled with spirit-swallowing bugs, why would the swordsmen of the Huan Kingdom use so many sword formations? Just this spirit-devouring array alone killed hundreds of thousands of people from my Dao sect. Indeed, Fairy Hongxia and Xiao Maro raised their heads and looked over. Although most of the spirit-devouring bugs flew towards the true Dao sect disciples, some of them left the group and pounced towards the ground. There was some vegetation on the ground, as well as some gravel. Creaking sounds could be heard as the gravel and vegetation gradually disappeared. Many spirit-swallowing bugs even pounced on some of the fallen celestial devices and magic treasures. However, these spirit-swallowing bugs were different from before. They swallowed the celestial devices bit by bit, and all the celestial devices and magic treasures were damaged. This is not a spirit-swallowing bug, but it is similar to the spirit-swallowing bug. Fairy Hongxia understood immediately. It must be that the swordsmen of the Huan Kingdom tried to cultivate the spirit-swallowing bugs but failed. Instead, they mutated. Those that devour gravel are probably earth-swallowing bugs, those that devour vegetation are wood-swallowing bugs, and those that devour celestial devices must be gold-swallowing bug. That's right. There are also water-swallowing bugs and fire-swallowing bugs. Now they are all here to join in the fun. Let's kill them all. Xiao Mao also shouted. He stretched out his hand and took out the magic treasures that he did not dare to use. However, at this moment, another scream came from afar. Another early golden elixir realm cultivator had his body broken through by the spirit-swallowing bugs and rushed into his body. This swordsman is really cunning. Fairy Hongxia said angrily. They used hundreds of real spirit-swallowing bugs to kill them, and tens of thousands of fake spirit-swallowing bugs as a smokescreen. Between the real and fake, who knows which is real and which is fake? Who cares if they are real or fake? Let's kill them first. Li Zongbao sneered. He waved his immortal piercing whip and chased after the spirit-swallowing bugs, killing them one by one. However, Li Zongbao, Xiao Maro, and Fairy Hongxia were too weak. They only killed less than 30 fake spirit-swallowing bugs in 10 minutes. The other cultivators were fleeing in panic. Who would notice their actions? Li Zongbao was very familiar with this scream. He hurriedly looked up and saw that Li Jijie of the Changbai sect was covered in blood. Finally, he could not resist the attack of the spirit-swallowing bugs and they rushed into his body. His corpse fell from the sky. Alas, Li Zongbao was silent. He knew that Li Jijie's flying sword was targeted by the spirit-swallowing bugs first. It was already good that he could hold on for so long. Unfortunately, he was a middle golden elixir realm cultivator of the Changbai sect and could not escape from being killed by the spirit-swallowing bug. Before he died, he did not even have time to use the talisman given by his sect. Li Jijie is dead. Are the other middle golden elixir realm masters far away? Li Zongbao looked around, looking for his master. In the distance, Hung Feng was also entangled by about 10 spirit-swallowing bugs. Hung Feng was afraid of attracting more spirit-swallowing bugs, so he did not dare to use magic. He only dared to move in the air. When he could not dodge, he dared to use his magic power. It seemed that they were of one mind. When Li Zongbao looked up, Hung Feng also turned his head. When he saw Li Zongbao's gaze, he immediately waved his hand and pointed to the west. The meaning was very clear. He wanted Li Zongbao to escape. But how could Li Zongbao leave? He moved his body and was about to fly over with the immortal piercing whip. Hung Feng was furious. He was careless and a spirit-swallowing bug almost rushed into his protective brilliance. Senior brother Li. Fairy Hongxia said anxiously, even if you go over, I'm afraid you are no match for him. You will attract the spirit-swallowing bugs for no reason. If Li Zongbao wanted to say, if Xiao Hua is there, what will you do? However, just as he said those two words, he heard a loud sword hum coming from the eastern horizon. A huge sword like a phoenix appeared in the air. Lu, Ruo, Chang. Li Zongbao said word by word. She. What killing move does she have now? Fairy Hongxia's expression changed. At this moment, 3 spirit-swallowing bugs flew towards the 3 of them, in the distance, in the direction that the Dao sect disciples had scattered and wanted to charge towards, which was 2 miles away. The faint smoke and dust was extremely dense. It was as if the smoke and dust that had covered dozens of miles had originated from this place. When Lu Ruochang's huge sword appeared in the air, a blurry figure appeared from the smoke. It was the first person that Lu Ruochang encountered when she entered the four-square sword formation, Night Rain, who was wearing a black sword formation. Night Rain was the same as before. His entire body was hidden in his sword armor. Only a pair of eyes could see outside. The rest of his body was not exposed. No one knew what he looked like. Lu Ruochang's phoenix sword essence was reflected in his eyes. It was a kind of eagerness. Night Rain stretched out his hand and took out a strange object. This object was like a statue. It was the size of a palm and was dark green. It looked very similar to the palace guarding bug. It had a triangular head, a small body, and a thumb-length tail. However, this object had 5 legs, which was different from the palace guarding bug's 4 legs. On its head, there was only one eye, which took up more than 60% of its head. Yi Yu took out the object and began to chant in a low voice. The strange syllables were emitted in an extremely rhythmic manner. After the time it took to brew a cup of tea, the object actually reacted. Its entire body emitted a faintly discernible green light. This green light had an extremely strong penetrative power. It even clearly illuminated the dense fog around Yi Yu. Seeing that the object was glowing, Night Rain stretched out her thumb and placed it in her mouth. She bit it lightly and blood oozed out from the pad of her thumb. Night Rain raised her thumb and looked at the blood that was slowly flowing out. Her chanting changed again. The sound seemed to have landed on the blood. The blood that oozed out did not coagulate. Instead, it slowly flowed on Night Rain's thumb. Gradually, a blood-red green seal script appeared on the pad of his thumb. This green seal character was so exquisite and so strange. The thick fog around him actually surged with the appearance of the green seal character like boiling water. A small character could actually have such power. If others were here, they would definitely be shocked. However, Night Rain seemed to be used to this. His eyes were abnormally calm, without any ripples. Poof! Seeing that the green seal character was formed and was about to fly out of his hand, Night Rain did not hesitate to open his mouth and spit a mouthful of essence blood on it. Night Rain's essence blood was originally a cluster, and the green seal character was extremely small. However, when the essence blood rushed out, the green seal character flashed a faint green light. All the essence blood landed on it. Even a faint shadow fell with the essence blood. As the green light flashed, it was pulled out of Night Rain's mouth. Moo tilde, it sounded like the moo of a cow. Just as the shadow fell into the green seal text, the green seal text suddenly made a sound. Night Rain's hand trembled slightly. It was as if the character suddenly became much heavier. Go tilde Night Rain did not dare to delay. His eyes were filled with anxiety. He flipped his hand and pressed his thumb on the object in the shape of the palace guardian bug with great difficulty. The green seal character formed by the blood landed on the object's eye. Whoosh tilde, as the green seal character landed on the object's eye, the palace guardian bug's eye suddenly opened. A cruel, bloody, and merciless green light swept out and rushed into the fog. Night Rain's face was extremely pale. His body was also trembling. As the palace guardian bug opened its eye, a green light appeared on its body. The palace guardian bug slowly floated in the air. -11. Chapter 2683. Few tilde Night Rain let out a long breath again. Then, she waved her hand, and several faint green lights shot out, hitting the air about 100 feet away. The thick fog was slowly lifted as the green lights hit it, as if a layer of gauze was being removed. Under the thin veil, there were 4 groups of sword cultivator disciples. These 4 groups of sword cultivator disciples were all dressed in different sword attire. They were scattered near Yi Yu, and each group had over 10,000 people. They surrounded Yi Yu. Fellow swordsman Knight. After the thick fog was lifted, a first-grade illusory swordsman standing in front of each group saw Night Rain. He hurriedly flew up and bowed, saying, "It's time for us to contribute to the sword realm, isn't it?" "That's right." Night Rain nodded slightly, but her voice was weak. She said lightly, "Fellow Taoists from the Sword School of Sword Mountain, the Pingli Sword School, the Flowing Wind Sword Village and the Flying Thunder Sword Sect, you've been lying in ambush here for nearly 5 years, so you're very familiar with the cooperation of this sword formation. Now LV Genu has sent a signal, and hundreds of thousands of practitioners from the Taoist sect have fallen into the spirit-devouring formation. Needless to say, the gold core practitioners in the formation have been attacked by the spirit-devouring bugs, so they have no time to take care of the foundation establishment and chi-refining disciples. Those disciples have been confused by LV Genu's deceptive tactic and have been utterly defeated. Now is the time for us to contribute to the sword realm. The leaders of the Four-Sword School were 2 men and 2 women. Hearing Night Rain's words, they were excited. Ji Ping, a grey-haired swordsman, bowed and said, "The Sword School of Sword Mountain is a small sect in the sword realm. Under the leadership of fellow swordsman Night Rain, we're able to come out for the sword realm and make such a great contribution. On behalf of more than 10,000 disciples of the Sword School of Sword Mountain, I'd like to thank fellow swordsman Night Rain. If fellow swordsman Night Rain needs any help in the future, we'll do anything for you." That's right. Tilda Lee Moji of the Pingli Sword School, a middle-aged swordswoman, also smiled and said, "According to LV Genu, it's because of fellow swordsman Night Rain that we have the opportunity to contribute to the sword realm. We're all very grateful to fellow swordsman Night Rain. Haha, it's fine. We are all disciples of the sword domain. If we can do something for the sword domain, so what if we die?" Yi Yu said with a faint smile. Flowing Wind Sword Manner's Fan Ping became even more charming. She smiled and said, "It's a pity that we've been training with sword friend Night Rain for 5 years, but we've never seen his true face. It's really a pity. There will be opportunities in the future. Our 4 sects only need to remember Night Rain sword friend's kindness." Flying Thunder Sword Sect's Huang Xing was a tall old man. His voice was also extremely loud. "He, my grace. You will naturally know in the future." Yi Yu's voice grew louder and louder. He waved his hand and said, "Now, my 4 friends, get ready. Tell your disciples to follow the previous formation and prepare to activate the sword origin." "Okay." The 4 of them shouted in unison. They were all abnormally excited. Yes, they were able to participate in the ambush of the 4 directions sword formation with the help of the sword formation. They did not need to fight the Taoist cultivators head-on. This was simply a naked military merit. Needless to say, the Yin-Yang sword formation and the 5-element sword formation, the disciples of the Kuan sword sect and the Taihe sword sect practiced the Yin-Yang flying sword. They were the best choice to set up the Yin-Yang sword formation. The 3 Swords sect and the Cauldron sword sect could also gather the 5 elements flying sword. However, in the sword domain, how could these 2 sects be the only ones who could gather the 5 elements flying sword? The reason why the 2 sword sects were included in the 4 directions sword formation was that they had a good relationship with the Black Phoenix sword sect. As for the Duanxue Villa in the spirit devouring formation, they were LV Ruochang's own subordinates. Everyone knew that the last formation was to deal with the cultivators who had escaped from the spirit devouring formation. Many swordsmen did not believe that those gold core cultivators could escape from the siege of thousands of spirit-devouring bugs. The last formation would definitely kill the most enemies among the 4 sword formations, which meant that it would have the greatest military merit. The masters of the 4 sects had never thought that such a good job would fall on them. After all, they were already the second-rate sword sects in the sword domain, even though they had once been glorious. However, because of the arrangement of this mysterious Yi Yu, the 4 sword sects were selected. The masters of the 4 sects were overjoyed and immediately sent out tens of thousands of elites to cooperate with Yi Yu's arrangement. They trained for 5 years. For such a reason, how could Ji Ping and the others not be grateful to Yi Yu? These words were really from the bottom of their hearts. When they heard Night Rain's orders, the 4 of them shouted loudly and flew into the air above their respective sword faction disciples. With a wave of their hands, sword beams shot into the sky. The nearly 40,000 disciples emitted a faint sword beam as their figures gradually move. It seemed to be an extremely mysterious trajectory. The 40,000 disciples guarded the surroundings of Night Rain, and each disciple moved within a certain range. 10 disciples formed a group, and formed a trajectory. 100 disciples, 1,000 disciples, and even 10,000 disciples from each sect formed a trajectory. The 40,000 disciples moved around Yi Yu at the same time. As the entire formation rotated, a strange suction force appeared above each disciple's head. Yi Yu's eyes flashed with intense passion. He pointed at the palace guardian insect that stopped in the air. The palace guardian insect's body shone brightly and it strangely moved in the air like a real palace guardian insect. Seeing the palace guardian insect crawl to the top of Yi Yu's head, Yi Yu suddenly raised his head and opened his mouth. A faint green light shot into the air like a sharp sword and rushed into the palace guardian insect's body. The palace guardian insect cried out in alarm. Its one eye shot out tens of thousands of green light beams into the sky like a fountain. Then, it scattered back down. The place where the green light landed was where the suction force came from. It was the top of each disciple's head. Kill! Yi Yu roared. The sword light around the 40,000 disciples flashed. The sword origin in their bodies was ready to come out. However, just as the sword origin was about to leave him, the green light beams immediately penetrated the disciples' heads. Every disciple's body was immediately covered by a layer of green light. The sword origin was immediately imprisoned in the disciples' bodies. Peng, peng, peng. A series of light explosions rang out continuously, lasting for the time it took to brew a cup of tea. Every light explosion was a disciple's sword origin surging and his body exploding. After every light explosion, the green light entered his flesh and merged with his sword origin. Sword friend Yi, what is going on? Ji Ping and the others were shocked and hurriedly shouted. Ha ha ha! Yi Yu raised his head and laughed happily. He said, "Didn't you all want to contribute to Sword Realm? Weren't you all not afraid of being crushed? Now, is the time for you all to sacrifice your lives for Sword Realm." But. Ji Ping was at a loss for words. He didn't know how to ask. "You, who are you? Why do you have to choose our four-sword sect?" Li Moji and Fan Ping, the two swordsmen, were the most meticulous. They almost shouted in unison. At this moment, Ji Ping and the others suddenly understood that the fourth sword formation of the four-sword formation was definitely not an ordinary sword formation. It was definitely an extremely sinister sword formation. Looking at the stance of their disciples, it was most likely a sinister sword formation that would exchange their lives for theirs. It was Yi Yu, a mysterious person that they had never seen before, who sent the 40,000 disciples of the four sects into this pit of fire. However, why would this mysterious Yi Yu treat the disciples of the four sects like this? Could it be that the four sects also had a grudge against him? In the blink of an eye, Ji Ping and the others had racked their brains countless times. It was as if they had racked their brains but still couldn't find a swordsman who had such a deep grudge against their sword sect. Ha ha ha, didn't you all say that you wanted to see my true appearance? Yi Yu laughed loudly. He stretched out his hand and pulled down his sword armor. He said, "I will now fulfill your last wish." Under the sword armor was an extremely handsome man. His eyebrows were sword-like and his nose was like a hanging gallbladder. He didn't seem to have any special features. Ji Ping and the others looked at him again and again. They couldn't remember anything at all. They couldn't help but smile bitterly at each other. "What? Can't you see who I am?" Yi Yu's eyes were filled with eagerness. His tone was much more cheerful than before. Ji Ping and the others smiled bitterly and then sneered, "I don't care what grudges you have with our four sects. However, you used the excuse of setting up the sword formation to avenge your personal grudge. You are the one that we hate the most in the Battle of Sword Domain. Today, we will fight to the death with you. We don't believe that the four illusory swordsmen can't escape from your hand. When we have a chance to live, we will find Lu Ruochang and Lu Jianyu and ask her to uphold justice for us." Ha ha ha! Seeing that the four illusory swordsmen were overflowing with sword light, the flying swords in their bodies were about to fly out. Yi Yu gently pointed his hand. 4 green rays of light fell from the top of the four people's heads. The green threads that were connected to their heads trembled rapidly. The four people's bodies were completely imprisoned by the green light, unable to move at all. "Lu Jianyu, are you still fantasizing about finding Lu Ruochang? How can this Yi let you all return alive?" Yi Yu said cheerfully. Besides, even if you survive, even if people suspect that more than 40,000 people from your 4 sects died, will Lu Ruochang blame me? What? Ji Ping and the others struggled with all their might. However, their sword origin was completely imprisoned by the green light. They couldn't move at all. They couldn't help but despair in their hearts. When they heard Yi Yu's words, they were immediately shocked. The feeling of being toyed with filled their hearts uncontrollably. You have colluded with Lu Ruochang? Fan Ping couldn't help but cry out. What do you mean by colluding? Yi Yu sneered, this is the promise that Lu Zhenyu gave me. It is also the price for me to kill hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators, using 40,000 disciples of your 4-sword sect to exchange for the lives of hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators. Don't you think it's an extremely good deal? -11. Chapter 2684. Shut up. Huang Xing said angrily, since you think it's worth it, why don't you let your sword's gate come here to die? Yi Yu's face twitched slightly, but there was a trace of reluctance in his eyes. He said faintly, yes, you all said that you could give up your lives for the sword domain, but now that it's come to this, you all go back on your word. We'd rather do that, but we don't want to die in your hands for no reason, Huang Xing shouted. However, Yi Yu ignored him and only muttered, as long as you're a human, regardless of whether you're a cultivator or a swordsman, you all have the desire to live. However, some people don't want this chance to live and choose death for the sake of others. But what about the others? They're not grateful to these people, and after making use of them, they wantonly killed their descendant. The heavenly Tao is fair. What are you talking about? Li Moji saw Yi Yu's crazy look and was very scared. He said anxiously, 40,000 of our sword's gate disciples have already fallen. Do you still want to live? Yi Yu looked up at the 4 of them and sneered, not just you, the foundations of your sword's gate in the sword domain. After the battle here, I'll kill you all. This is something that LV Ruochang has already agreed to. Only by completely wiping out all 4 of your clans will I be able to reveal my true face in broad daylight. Who are you? Why do you have such a deep hatred for our sword's gate? Ji Ping's face twitched. Before death, the desire to know the answer was incomparably huge. Didn't you just say it? You want my sword's gate to come here to die. Yi Yu said faintly, my sword's gate has already done it 8,000 years ago. 8,000 years? Ji Ping was stunned, as if he couldn't remember anything. You're a remnant of the flying dragon sword gate? Huang Xing suddenly remembered something and exclaimed. Ha ha ha. Not bad, there's actually someone who knows about my flying dragon sword gate. Yi Yu waved his hand, and an orange-yellow sword light soared into the sky. With a roar, a dragon-shaped sword intent flashed out from the sword light, and an enormous and indescribable aura spread out from the dragon-shaped sword, enveloping an area of several hundred feet. Flying Dragon Sword Sect, it really is the Flying Dragon Sword Sect. Ji Ping muttered in a daze. That's right. Since you know that I, Yi, am a disciple of the Flying Dragon Sword Sect, you should know why I, Yi, am here, right? Yi Yu said coldly, 8,000 years ago, your 4 sects took advantage of the fact that my Flying Dragon Sword Sect's vitality was greatly damaged to invade my dragon platform and exterminate my descendants. Tell me, should I not take revenge today? Sword friend Yi. Huang Xing said helplessly, that was 8,000 years ago. What does it have to do with us? It's better to squash enmity than to keep it alive. You've killed tens of thousands of disciples from our 4 sects, so you should have avenged your Flying Dragon Sword Sect, right? The 4 of us don't plan on going back alive. The other disciples of our 4 sects are even more innocent. Thousands of years ago, the disciples of my Flying Dragon Sword Sect who were stationed at the dragon platform were not innocent. When your 4 sects annihilated my Flying Dragon Sword Sect that day, did you ever consider that you were innocent? Yi Yu said coldly, now, you're just complaining. How can you be innocent? Furthermore, the Sword Region Dragon platform belongs to my Flying Dragon Sword Sect. You've occupied it for thousands of years. Shouldn't you leave? Shouldn't you pay the price? Yi Yu lifted his eyes to look towards the east as he spoke. The sounds of fighting were already faintly discernible. He snorted from his nose and said, "This Yi is too lazy to say anything more to all of you. This Yi is only telling all of you this because all of you have been so respectful towards this Yi over the past 5 years. All of you should hurry over. The credit of killing hundreds of thousands of Dao sect disciples is waiting for this Yi to share with everyone." Following that, Yi Yu raised his hand and the 4 of them were surrounded by a green light. The 4 of them didn't even have time to make a sound before they turned into bloodstains. These 4 bloodstains were the same as the other 40,000 bloodstains. Although they no longer had any vitality, they were still spinning like before. "Rise!" Yi Yu roared. He opened his mouth and a faint green light was shot at the palace guarding bug. The palace guarding bug moved slightly, and the tens of thousands of green threads trembled at the same time. Phantoms emerged from the bloodstains. They were the vengeful spirits of the 40,000 swordsmen from the 4 sect. Once these vengeful spirits were drawn out, a vicious aura immediately rushed out. This vicious aura gathered together and even dispersed the thick fog. "Ha ha ha." Yi Yu laughed. He pointed his hand and the tens of thousands of green threads flew out and landed on the tens of thousands of bloodstains. The bloodstains boiled and countless bubbles emerged from the bloodstains. Streaks of bloody light followed the green threads and rushed into the palace guarding bug. The bloodstains quickly shrank. Soon, all of the bloodstains disappeared. The palace guarding bug became half the size of a person and its body emitted a red and dark green light. Squeak. The palace guarding bug raised its head and made a sound. The sound was not right, but the invisible wave spread far away. As the wave swept across, the vengeful spirits slowly rushed out from the ground of the sword tomb one after another. Yi Yu flew up and landed on the palace guarding insect's body. The palace guarding insect carried Yi Yu and quickly crawled through the air. Tens of thousands of vengeful spirits surged toward the east like a tide, which was where the Dao sect cultivators were charging from. Within a radius of several miles around Yi Yu, even more vengeful spirits surged forth like a thin tide and gathered toward the battlefield. On the battlefield, 3 spirit-swallowing bugs quietly turned into 3 black lines and rushed to the left of Li Zongbao and the others. Li Zongbao and the others had already noticed it. "Humph!" Li Zongbao sneered. He waved his hand and the immortal piercing whip hit the spirit-swallowing bugs again. But something unexpected happened. This time, the spirit-swallowing bugs were not knocked away like before. Instead, they opened their mouths and bit the light of the immortal piercing whip and started to chew it. "Ah! Spirit-swallowing bugs!" Li Zongbao was shocked. He hurriedly activated his Dharma power and the light of the immortal piercing whip shone brightly. He wanted to knock the spirit-swallowing bugs away. But as soon as he moved, the 2 spirit-swallowing bugs that were flying toward Xiao Maro and Fairy Hongxia were immediately attracted by the light of the immortal piercing whip and rushed toward Li Zongbao. Li Zongbao hurriedly activated his flying skill to escape, but he was not as fast as the spirit-swallowing bugs. In a moment, 2 spirit-swallowing bugs caught up with him and bit the light of the immortal piercing whip. "What should I do now?" Li Zongbao had always treated the immortal piercing whip as his treasure. When he saw the 3 spirit-swallowing bugs devouring the light of the whip, he knew that in a moment, his whip would be turned into ordinary iron like Li Jijie's flying sword. He was extremely anxious. At this time, Fairy Hongxia and Xiao Maro also flew over. Although they did not dare to get too close, they were not too far away. But they were helpless when they saw the 3 spirit-swallowing bugs. "Should we use the congenital primordial water?" Fairy Hongxia hesitated and gritted her teeth. However, the congenital primordial water was activated by the Ice Phoenix celestial body. Although the celestial body did not need to be released, the fluctuation of the celestial body, was it spiritual energy? Fairy Hongxia could not be sure. Moreover, the celestial body was more than 100 feet long. It was far more attractive to the spirit-swallowing bugs than ordinary cultivators. Fairy Hongxia was afraid that she would become the target of the spirit-swallowing bugs the moment she released the Ice Phoenix celestial body. The consequences would be worse than Li Zongbao losing the immortal piercing whip. Attack! Li Zongbao helplessly used his Dharma incantation, such as the fireball skill and the confinement skill, one after another. Unfortunately, None of them were effective. The light of the immortal piercing whip gradually disappeared in the mouths of the spirit-swallowing bugs. Forget it. Li Zongbao shook his hand and was about to throw away the immortal piercing whip. But at this time, the spirit-swallowing bugs flew up again and headed for Li Zongbao's arm. Obviously, they had followed the trajectory of Li Zongbao's Dharma power. Oh no! Li Zongbao also saw Qi Ming and Li Jijie being killed. How could he not know the power of the spirit-swallowing bugs? He hurriedly flew up. Just as before, Li Zongbao had only flown a few feet when the spirit-swallowing bugs were already behind him. Li Zongbao trembled with fear and could only activate the Dharma power in his body, regardless of whether it would attract more spirit-swallowing bugs. At this critical moment, there was a loud buzzing sound. In the sky, about 1,000 feet behind Heng Heng, a faint light flashed. Dozens of strong hurricanes appeared and a huge palm gradually formed. It was unknown which middle-stage gold core cultivator could not resist the attack of the spirit-swallowing bugs and could not help but use the talisman given by his sec. The hand of the nascent soul had already been activated. The powerful confinement skill firmly held the dozens of spirit-swallowing bugs surrounding the cultivator. However, many of the spirit-swallowing bugs around the cultivator were attracted by the spiritual power of the talisman. They abandoned their targets and flew toward the hand of the nascent soul. The 3 spirit-swallowing bugs on Li Zongbao's back were also attracted by the talisman. They turned their heads and flew toward the hand of the nascent soul, ignoring Li Zongbao. I was lucky. Li Zongbao's back was sweating. He could not help but whisper. He lowered his head and looked at the immortal piercing whip in his hand, which had lost its brilliance. He regretfully and reluctantly put it into his storage bag. Oh no, it's Uncle Liang Mingfu from the Nanming sect. Fairy Hong Xia's eyes were sharp. She had already seen the gold core cultivator using the hand of the nascent soul. She could not help but cry out. Sure enough, Liang Mingfu made an incantation. The hand of the nascent soul clenched fiercely. When the hand opened, the dozens of spirit-swallowing bugs that were caught fell from the sky. However, after falling for a few feet, 2 or 3 of them flapped their wings and flew up again. The other 10 spirit-swallowing bugs fell with the wind and did not fly up again. Seeing this, Liang Mingfu's face lit up. However, his joy only flashed for a moment before it froze on his face. Within 100 feet, dozens of spirit-swallowing bugs were attracted by the spiritual qi of the nascent soul's talisman. They flew toward the hand. -11. Chapter 2685. Damn it! Liang Mingfu shouted and was about to cast another spell. But at this time, the dozens of black lines had flown to the big hand, and dozens of black spots appeared on the big hand like spot. Seal. Liang Mingfu dared not hesitate. His Dharma power surged, and the big hand emitted a faint light again, driving all the spirit-swallowing bugs away from the big hand. When Liang Mingfu was about to control the big hand to catch the spirit-swallowing bugs, they opened their sharp teeth again and started to chew the light of the Yuan Ying's hand. You're courting death. Liang Mingfu snorted and slowly grabbed the spirit-swallowing bugs with his big hand again. Uncle Liang, watch out. Li Zongbao's voice was very loud. Oh! Liang Mingfu was in danger and hurriedly released his divine thought. Sure enough, just behind him, dozens of spirit-swallowing bugs scattered and flew towards him. At this time, they were less than 3 feet away from him. How can these spirit-swallowing bugs be so cunning? Liang Mingfu was shocked. He moved quickly and the Yuan Ying's hand smashed towards the spirit-swallowing bugs again. The spirit-swallowing bugs were almost unable to move under the restriction of the Yuan Ying's hand. Suddenly, the big hand made a deafening sound. Damn it! Liang Mingfu heard it and his face changed greatly. Before he could do anything, boom! With another loud sound, the Yuan Ying's hand suddenly collapsed in the air and turned into a broken talisman again, falling slowly. The spirit-swallowing bugs that had swallowed the Yuan Ying's hand swarmed towards Liang Mingfu like a swarm of bees. Run! Liang Mingfu only had one thought in his mind, and his body suddenly swayed apart. Just as Liang Mingfu flew several meters away, a spirit-swallowing bug strangely rushed towards him from the side. Liang Mingfu waved his hand, and 2 more spirit-swallowing bugs appeared on his left side. Liang Mingfu's heart sank. When he just raised his other hand, Buzz Tilda, as if thousands of bees were dancing around his ears, Liang Mingfu was very anxious. He scanned with his divine thought and his face turned pale. He saw that the dozens of spirit-swallowing bugs had already landed on his back and were devouring his protective golden light. Oh no. Without hesitation, Liang Mingfu made a prompt decision to cast an incantation before the protective golden light was extinguished. Boom tilde with a loud bang, the space within a radius of hundreds of feet shook violently. Countless airwaves rushed in all directions from here, and the dozens of spirit-swallowing bugs were also pushed more than 1,000 feet away. That was not all. Within 100 jong of Liang Mingfu, there were several Golden Core cultivators and quite a few Foundation Establishment disciples. The Golden Core cultivators were still able to escape in a panic, but the Foundation Establishment disciples were miserable. Although they tried their best to escape, they were still unable to escape the impact of the Golden Core explosion. Most of them died. The pitiful thing was that instead of dying in the mouth of the spirit-swallowing bugs, they were dragged to the grave by their own teachers. For a moment, the area within 1,000 feet of where Liang Mingfu had exploded was completely empty. How terrifying! Xiao Maro exclaimed in shock when he saw how powerful Liang Mingfu's self-destruction was. Li Zongbao, Fairy Hongxia, and Xiao Maro were originally quite a distance away from Liang Mingfu. After Liang Mingfu flew in the opposite direction, they were at the edge of the 1,000 feet radius. When Liang Mingfu self-destructed, they hurriedly dodged and did not suffer much damage. That's amazing. Unlike Xiao Maro, Fairy Hongxia saw that after Liang Mingfu's self-destruction, only half of the spirit-swallowing bugs fell to the air. The other half flapped their wings again and rushed toward the nearby Golden Core cultivators. Master Li Zongbao was shocked again. Heng Jiao was very close to Liang Mingfu, so he was the first to bear the brunt of the self-destruction. When he hurriedly dodged, more spirit-swallowing bugs were pushed to his side by the airwave. Unfortunately, this wasn't the most important thing. Right at this moment, countless sword cries resounded from beneath the cultivators, and tens of thousands of enormous flying swords charged straight out from the ground. Sword light flickered, and sword chi crisscrossed. It was precisely the swordsman that Lu Ruochang had hidden within the spirit-devouring grand formation that had attacked at the same time. Previously, only the spirit-swallowing bugs were wreaking havoc in the soul-devouring formation. Under the control of Fan Kuei-Yuan's pagoda, their main targets were the cultivators at the Golden Core stage. The Foundation Establishment and Qi-refining disciples were only disturbed by the so-called gold-swallowing bugs and earth-swallowing bugs. Of course, many disciples were killed by the real spirit-swallowing bugs, and their corpses were everywhere. Now, the sword formation showed its sharp teeth again. Its target was the Foundation Establishment disciples who had lost their fighting spirit. Li Zongbao wanted to help his master, but the huge sword was condensed by many sword lights. Obviously, it was the joint attack of a group of sword cultivators. How could Li Zongbao be distracted? He hurriedly clapped his hands and habitually took out the immortal piercing whip. However, the immortal piercing whip had been destroyed by the spirit-swallowing bugs. How could it be useful? Li Zongbao sighed and hurriedly looked for other magic weapons. Fortunately, Xiao Maro and Fairy Hongxia were beside him. The two of them temporarily protected Li Zongbao. The huge sword of the soul-devouring formation was born. As the sword chi surged, hundreds of spirit-swallowing bugs were attracted to it. However, in the sky, the fluctuations of the pagoda suddenly intensified. The spirit-swallowing bugs only hesitated for a moment before they rushed towards the Golden Core stage cultivators again. Now, there were less than 160,000 Dao sect cultivators left. They had long been reduced to mere chickens and pottery dogs. There was no way they could form an army. During the first 2 battles, they could still form simple formations to fight against the giant sword. Now, they could only rely on their instincts to flee in all directions. Many disciples had even died at the hands of other cultivators. For a moment, screams rang out everywhere. In the flashing sword lights, it was like purgatory. Not only that. Under the attack of the spirit-swallowing bugs, more and more Golden Core stage cultivators used their final killing moves. One by one, protective talismans were used. Although these nascent Soul stage cultivators could kill some of the spirit-swallowing bugs, once they used their talismans, they attracted more spirit-swallowing bugs. It was tantamount to drinking poison to quench thirst. In just a short time, more than 10 Golden Core stage cultivators died. Among them, there were several Golden Core stage elders in the conference hall. Ku Xiangling of the Yongyi sect, Zhu Junwei of the Cool Breeze Valley, Yuan Yiguang of the Blue Li sect, and Qing Zai of the Mosang Mountain were all cultivators in the early stage of Golden Core stage. They had been injured outside the Sword Tomb. Although they had recuperated for a while, how could they protect themselves under the attack of the spirit-swallowing bugs? One by one, the spirit-swallowing bugs rushed into their bodies and swallowed their golden cores. Hua Ping from the Blazing Fire Mountain was proficient in the art of controlling fire. Wisps of flame flew to the left and right from time to time, luring the spirit-swallowing bugs to fly to the left and right. At the same time, she also wandered on the edge of the cliff of death. Huang Feng from the exotic beast sect was also strange. He had a strange beast that looked like a green snake coiled around his finger. From time to time, he would make a sharp hissing sound from his mouth, which made the besieging spirit-swallowing bugs a little afraid of him. However, these cultivators in the early stage of Golden Core stage were just on the verge of death. They would die if they didn't do anything. Heng Ming and other cultivators in the middle stage of Golden Core stage were still trying their best to hold on. When they heard the sound of self-explosion from time to time, they felt bitter in their hearts. They knew that the Taoism sect cultivators were really defeated in this battle. However, they still had a little hope in their hearts. They wanted to find a chance to escape from this spirit-swallowing formation. Wu tilde like a gust of cold wind, a chill appeared on Heng Ming's face. Oh! Heng Ming was slightly stunned. He was a cultivator in the Golden Core stage. Usually, he was immune to cold and heat. How could he feel the cold wind at will? Not to mention that he was fighting hard against the spirit-swallowing bugs. Heng Ming couldn't help looking around. When he looked around, he felt a chill in his heart. As far as the eye could see, there was a flash of sword light. Outside the sword light, there was a thick fog. Within the fog, wisps of dark green were faintly discernible. At the same time, there were strange cries of ghosts and howls of wolves coming from within the fog. Obviously, the fog had been there for a long time, but Heng Ming didn't notice it. All the disciples in the foundation establishment stage and the qi refining stage who had escaped earlier were forced back by the fog. Although these disciples activated their flying talismans and flying skills, it was obvious that their Dharma power had been exhausted. From time to time, some disciples were infected by the fog. However, those who were sprayed by the fog all fell from the sky without making a sound and no longer moved. Heng Ming really sucked in a breath of cold air. His heart was cold and an unparalleled sense of despair rose in his heart. LV Ruochang had really put in a lot of effort in this square sword formation. He had used all his methods. The yin-yang sword formation killed cultivators in the middle stage of the foundation establishment stage and below. The 5-element sword formation killed cultivators in the Golden Core stage and above, and the spirit-swallowing bugs killed cultivators in the Golden Core stage and above. As for the remaining cultivators, they were killed by this mysterious fog. From the moment the hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators fell into the square sword formation, their fates had already been decided by the swordsmen of the Heng Kingdom. LV Ruochang would not let a single cultivator fly out of this sword formation, no matter if it was qi refining, foundation establishment or golden core. There are dozens of sects in the Dao sect. Why are there no senior brothers in the later stage of the Golden Core stage participating in this battle? At this moment, Heng Ming suddenly thought of LV Ruochang's question. Could it be that the Dao sect is bound to lose in this battle of Dao cultivators? Do the teachers of each sect already know? Or is there another reason? Heng Ming naturally did not have an answer to this question. Looking at the fog flashing with green light, Heng Ming had already lost the courage to fight. He also did not have the strength to resist the attacks of dozens of spirit-swallowing bugs. Even if a senior brother in the later stage of the Golden Core stage came, he would not have a second chance of survival. At this moment, in the thick fog, a green shadow gradually became clear. It was the palace guarding bug, which had already become 10 feet long. This palace guarding bug's body was strangely distorted and the green light was flickering rapidly. On the palace guarding bug's back, Night Rain, who was dressed in black, gradually appeared. -11. Chapter 2686. Soul Armament. Hung Feng's body trembled uncontrollably as he stared at the beetle. Ever since he took charge of the council hall, he had read up on many of the previous battles in the council hall. He had even read up on some of the information and records from Sky Patrol City. Thus, he had some understanding of the situation in the Huan Kingdom. Now that he saw the green glow of the beetle, which was as agile as a spirit beast, how could he not know that it was a soul armament? Lu Ruochang has gone mad. In order to win this war, he actually lured soul cultivators into the Huan Kingdom. Heng Ji turned pale with fright. But when he saw Yi Yu's true face, he was a bit surprised. This soul warrior seems to be different from what is recorded in the ancient records. Master. Li Zhongbao's voice sounded distant. Heng Feng was startled again. When he looked again, a spirit-devouring bug had already climbed onto his protective golden light. Forget it, everything is about to end. Heng Ju raised his head and looked over. Li Zhongbao, Fairy Hongxia and the rest were trying their best to resist the sword light. Seeing his proud disciple like this, Heng Ju felt gratified. Perhaps this kind of life is what Zhongbao should have. But I won't be able to see it. Seeing a spirit-devouring bug bite through Heng Feng's protective golden light without any resistance, Li Zhongbao's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. At this critical moment, when all the Dao sect cultivators were about to be wiped out, an indescribable pressure surged from the west of the sword formation like a rising tide. This pressure was very weak in the eyes of Heng Ming and the rest, but it was simple, tenacious, and peculiar. This pressure was like a rising tide, instantly enveloping the great spirit-devouring formation and even surging toward the east. Following which, a huge sealing force descended from the sky, completely enveloping the entire four directions sword array. This sealing force was so strong that all the cultivators, swordsmen, and even the spirit-devouring bugs stopped in their track. Ah! Someone is condensing their core. When Heng Ju felt this pressure, he immediately knew that it was the pressure of a golden core cultivator. Just like Yu Tong, when the sealing force appeared, Heng Ju also understood that it was the celestial phenomenon of a cultivator's breakthrough. What a pity! Heng Feng felt a trace of regret. This late-stage foundation establishment disciple is not condensing his core at the right time. If it was a few days earlier, he would have succeeded. Now that he's condensing his core here, there are spirit-devouring bugs, swordsmen, and even soul warriors. How could he succeed? However, the power of imprisonment was not what Heng Jiao had imagined. It grew stronger, and everyone was trapped in it. Especially those spirit-swallowing bugs, they were tightly confined and could not move at all. This. Like Yu Tong, Heng Feng's heart was in turmoil. He was a middle-stage golden core disciple of the Utopia faction, so he was very clear about the details of a late-stage golden core cultivator's pregnancy. He knew better than Yu Tong about the signs of a late-stage golden core cultivator's pregnancy. This sealing force could only be produced by a late-stage foundation establishment cultivator's pregnancy. It was absolutely impossible for a late-stage foundation establishment cultivator to condense his core. Which senior brother is actually in the sword catacomb? Heng Feng was almost stunned. No cultivator, no matter if it was the state of Shi, the state of Meng, or the state of Lian, with any common sense, would conceive a baby in the sword catacomb. However, Heng Feng was only stunned for a moment. Then, a thought of escaping from death appeared in his mind. His previously dead vitality sprouted like a bud. Heng Feng knew that in the early years, the Taoism sect cultivators who were trapped in the sword formation relied on several late-stage golden core cultivators to conceive a baby. From there, they won a chance of survival and defeated the swordsmen who were already confident of victory. Now, wasn't this the Taoism sect cultivators repeating the same trick. Wasn't this the best opportunity for them to kill the spirit-swallowing bugs and escape? Almost without thinking, Hung Feng reached out his hand and took out the nascent soul talisman with difficulty from his storage bag. Then, he activated the Dharma power in his body with difficulty. Buzz tilde with a flash of brilliance, the nascent soul hand slowly expanded. In this confinement that was comparable to that of a pregnant baby, the nascent soul hand could still be activated. Since Hung Feng had such a thought, De Zun, Xiong Huasong, and the others naturally had the same idea. All the golden core cultivators in the conference hall who had talismans activated their nascent soul hand. Although there were hundreds or even thousands of spirit-swallowing bugs, they were different from the golden core cultivators in this confinement phenomenon. They trembled very much, as if they were extremely afraid. The fluctuations of the pagoda in the sky were also disturbed by this confinement force. The spirit-swallowing bugs were no longer under control. They froze in midair, and the nascent soul hands grabbed them and crushed them to death. Damn it! What? Why is it a pregnant baby again? Outside the spirit-swallowing formation, LV Ruochang and the others were also affected by this confinement force. Their expressions changed greatly. LV Ruochang almost stomped his feet in midair and said hatefully, which golden core cultivator is pregnant? Among the hundreds of thousands of cultivators in the Taoist sect, there is no disciple in the later stage of golden core, right? Seeing that the confinement force was getting stronger, LV Ruochang was so angry that his whole body trembled. Boom! A huge explosion came from the spirit-swallowing formation in the distance. A burst of yellow brilliance shot up into the sky and shook the confinement force. Fan Ming Yuan, Fan Zhenyu. LV Ruochang saw this and his expression changed again. Inside the spirit-devouring formation, yellow light soared into the sky, and the area within a radius of several thousand feet was hit by a powerful wave of air. The restrictive force inside the formation was shattered by the explosion of the pagoda that Fan Kuei-Yuan had turned into. The remaining hundreds of spirit-devouring bugs once again had blood-red light in their eyes, and they madly charged toward the nascent soul hands of Hung Feng and the others. This time, the spirit-swallowing bugs were even more powerful. In a moment, the nascent soul hands were devoured. The hope that the Taoist sect cultivators had just had was snuffed out again. Fan Zhenyu. LV Ruochang looked up at the sky and said sorrowfully, "The warriors of the sword region will never forget your contributions." Then, he urged the sword light under his feet to fly slowly in the confinement force. He said coldly, "Even if there is a golden core cultivator in the later stage of golden core, so what? Not to mention this spirit-swallowing formation, even my final killing move is not something that a pregnant Tian Jiao can defeat." However, before LV Ruochang could fly more than 10 feet, strong hurricanes were set off in the space enveloped by the confinement force. The center of these hurricanes was a small virtual point. As these hurricanes grew stronger, the virtual point gradually revealed a shiny silver-white light spot. Once this light spot appeared, it immediately condensed and grew larger. In a moment, it grew to the size of a thumb, then a fist, and finally a dipper. This dipper was surrounded by a huge whirlpool. The golden spiritual chi of heaven and earth in the whirlpool was constantly gathering, forming many pearls. The golden spiritual chi of heaven and earth in the entire square sword formation was swept away and turned into these crystals. For a moment, the radiance of the magic tools and magic treasures on the battlefield dimmed, and the sword light gradually disappeared. Some cultivators who had exhausted their magic power couldn't even stand steadily in the air, and actually fell from the sky. Of course, this situation only stagnated for a moment. Gusts of wind swept up in the formation again. The spiritual chi of heaven and earth and sword chi in other parts of the sword tomb surged toward the formation again. LV Ruochang was stunned. Heng Ting was even more stunned. But while Heng Ting was stunned, he was also pleasantly surprised. This was because the spirit-swallowing bugs attacking the nascent soul hands were obviously attracted by the vast amount of golden spiritual chi of heaven and earth. They did not care about the hands of the nascent soul and the golden core cultivators. Thousands of spirit-swallowing bugs, whether real or fake, rushed toward the huge crystal. The spirit-swallowing formation, was no longer effective. This does not seem to be a pregnant senior brother at the peak of the later stage of Golden Core. A pregnant senior brother shouldn't have crystals. Hung Ting almost stretched out a hand from his throat. Only pure spirit tide can form a nascent soul, right? But, if it is not a pregnant senior brother, how can there be such a huge crystal? Perhaps this senior brother's nascent soul is different from that of ordinary cultivators? This could only be Hung Teng's guess. Quick! After LV Ruochang recovered from his shock, he did not have time to care about the abnormality of the pregnant senior brother. He cried out to the group of third-grade illusory swordsmen, "Let's hurry and find the location of this senior brother's nascent soul before he is pregnant. From the looks of it, he is not far away. Maybe we can take the opportunity to kill him. But what about the Golden Core cultivators in the spirit-swallowing formation?" Ruoling was a little weak, but she still asked, "It is very difficult to kill a nascent soul. Why don't we take the opportunity to kill the rest of the Dao sect disciples?" LV Ruochang said confidently, "I have a soul-killing formation outside the spirit-swallowing formation, even if there is a pregnant senior brother." As he spoke, a rumbling sound of thunder rang out from the sky above the sword catacomb. Within 100 miles of the sky, the rolling dark clouds surged rapidly, and faintly discernible golden threads danced in the dark cloud. A vast killing intent, through the power of imprisonment, filled the space between heaven and earth. Pu-LV Ruochang sensed the killing intent of this heavenly thunder. How could he not know that this was the nemesis of spirit warriors? A mouthful of blood spurted out from his mouth, and he was practically dispirited in midair. Junior sister LV. Ruoling was shocked and hurriedly flew forward to support LV Ruochang. LV Ruochang's eyes were lifeless, like a dead fish. He stared straight at the sky and muttered, "In the sword catacomb where lightning does not occur, when will there be heavenly thunder? This cultivator who is pregnant in the sword catacomb, who is this expert? Alas, since LV Husheng was born. Could it be that this is what she said? That I was too clever in my calculations, and in the end, I ruined Qingqing's life?" LV Ruochang was sad. Could it be that I can only fail at the last minute? This is predestined. -11. Chapter 2687. Just as LV Ruochang expected, outside the spirit-devouring formation, the rolling fog was still moving forward slowly and steadily, although it was affected by the confinement force. Although the palace-guarding Bug and Yi Yu could not fly in the air, they had already landed on the ground, but they were still crawling forward step by step. However, sooner or later, they would meet the Taoist sect cultivators, and these cultivators would be killed by Yi Yu's soul-destroying formation. Heng Zhao and the others were ready for the final battle. However, when the heavenly thunder broke through the confinement formation, Yi Yu's face changed greatly. Others did not know, but he saw clearly through the soul-destroying formation. All the vengeful souls were struggling painfully in the heavenly thunder, and many of them had turned into white smoke and disappear. More powerful vengeful souls, attracted by the soul-destroying formation, were fleeing in panic. Yi Yu looked at the sky, and he was also confused. But just as he was confused, the heavenly thunder in the sky became more intense. The golden light was shining, and it slowly gathered in a place in the west. Oh no! In the golden light, the heavenly thunder became more and more powerful. Yi Yu's soul-destroying formation trembled in fear, and the green light around it gradually dimmed. Yi Yu complained secretly and hurriedly recited the soul incantation, and the soul-destroying formation shrank rapidly. When the soul-destroying formation was restored, Yi Yu looked at the 40,000 vengeful souls of the Sword Mountain and the Four Sword Schools reluctantly. He wanted to activate the soul-destroying formation to collect them, but these vengeful souls were trapped in a quagmire under the heavenly thunder. No matter how Yi Yu activated the soul-destroying formation, he could not take any vengeful souls away from the heavenly thunder. Without the vengeful souls, how could Yi Yu dare to face the Golden Core cultivators? Yi Yu's figure slowly disappeared as he prepared to leave. However, Yi Yu's figure flickered several times, but he just couldn't disappear. Under the might of the heavenly lightning, His soul cultivation movement technique was also affected. Hang Jiao and the others were killing the spirit-devouring bugs while observing Yi Yu. They saw Yi Yu collect the soul-destroying formation, and his figure flickered several times, and then he turned around and left. How could they not know that he had given up the soul-destroying formation? Overjoyed, he hurriedly circulated his true essence to fight against the binding force while killing the swordsman. Relying on the strength of a single person to break Lu Ruochang's plan of several years, relying on the strength of a single person to save hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators from certain death. Other than Xiao Hua, who was preparing to condense his core in the Brahma Gold Palace, in this Dawn Rain continent, who else could it be? However, Xiao Hua's situation was not as simple as Heng Jiao and LV Ruochang thought. Xiao Hua originally wanted to rely on his advanced celestial phenomenon restriction to kill Yu Tong, but just as he was about to make a move, a tearing pain suddenly appeared in his lower dantian, as if his entire dantian was about to be torn apart. When his divine sense sank into his lower dantian, he was unconsciously scared out of his wit. He saw a light purple thing slowly rotating between his two lightning cores. A huge suction force came from this light purple thing. This suction force rushed into his qi refining and foundation establishment meridians. This situation was originally recorded in Zhen Qing's experience of condensing one's core. Other than the two lightning cores, everything else was roughly the same. However, what caused Xiao Hua to turn pale with fright was the suction force generated by the core condensation. This suction force was divided into two, each containing the power of the heavenly Dao. The power of the heavenly Dao in these two suction forces was different according to the Dao of Yin and Yang. One was Yang, the other was Yin. They were separately sucked into his two meridians. If it was an ordinary cultivator who condensed their core, the Yin and Yang suction forces would be completely balanced. Because of the different Yin and Yang attributes, the solidified true essence absorbed would produce a fusion of Yin and Yang, which would allow the true essence to condense into a golden core in the dantian. But at this moment, the suction force in Xiao Hua's two meridians was completely different. The suction force in the qi refining meridians was more than 40% greater than the suction force in the foundation establishment meridians. This enormous suction force twisted Xiao Hua's lower dantian. This kind of heart-tearing and lung-splitting pain was more severe than any kind of needle pricking. Moreover, this suction force had already penetrated deep into his meridians. The unbalanced power twisted all the meridians in Xiao Hua's body. Seeing this situation, Xiao Hua understood. If it was an ordinary core condensation, then he would have taken the dry separation pill. The dry separation pill could accelerate the solidification of the true essence flowing within the meridians. This solidified true essence would be sent into the light purple area by the suction force, and the golden core that countless foundation establishment cultivators yearned for day and night would condense there. However, would Xiao Hua dare to take the dry separation pill now? His two suction forces were completely unbalanced. Not to mention whether or not it would affect the two meridians, even the amount of true essence used to condense the golden core would be different because of the difference in the yin and yang suction forces. And with different amounts of yin and yang true essence, could it condense into a complete golden core? Xiao Hua could almost think of the answer with his heel. It was absolutely impossible. The only result of doing this was that the yang true essence would be greater than the yin true essence, resulting in the asymmetry of the golden core. This golden core could only collapse, and he could only die. There was not a moment when Xiao Hua didn't want to cultivate to the golden core realm, but now, he had truly condensed his golden core, yet he was incomparably regretful. This young master, why did I have to cultivate to the 18th layer of qi refining that day? Why didn't this young master think of the difference between the yin and yang suction forces? Xiao Hua was incomparably remorseful. Martial Uncle Zhen Qing, why didn't you write an extra sentence in the jade slip? However, all of Xiao Hua's remorse, all of his complaints, how could they change reality? On the Dawn Rain continent, no one had ever cultivated a cultivation method after the 12th layer of qi refining. This kind of conformist matter was bound to have a cause and effect. If it wasn't for the fact that the meridians refined by the 12th layer of qi refining were exactly the same as the meridians refined by the 3rd layer of foundation establishment, how could this qi refining cultivation method only have the 12th layer, and not the 11th or the 13th layer? Perhaps many years ago, there were people who cultivated to the 11th or 13th layer. Perhaps they also failed or even died when condensing their golden core at this time. Perhaps these lessons were passed down by word of mouth many years ago, or even recorded in a taboo. However, after so many years, cultivators had already forgotten about it. Everyone thought that the 12th layer of qi refining was a matter of course, but who would really think about why it was precisely the 12th layer? Even if Xiao Hua asked Master Wu Xian to answer, Wu Xian might not necessarily be able to say anything. Instead, he would probably fly into a rage and berate Xiao Hua, forcing Xiao Hua to cultivate peacefully. However, Xiao Hua had the memories of cultivating to the 18th layer of qi refining, yet he wouldn't ask Wu Xian for advice. Furthermore, Zhen Qing's jade slip also didn't have any records of the balance between yin and yang. Most importantly, in order to find his own origin, Xiao Hua chose to cultivate to the 18th layer of qi refining without hesitation. All of these were enough to lead to today's tragedy. Of course, before these tragedies, Xiao Hua once again tasted the countless benefits of cultivating to the 18th layer of qi refining. His true essence was a lot more vigorous than ordinary cultivators, and he had the advantage in fights. His divine sense was also far stronger than others, and his cultivation speed was also far faster than others. Unfortunately, everything had a price. Although many times, this price was their life, there would always be people who would risk everything to do it. Others laugh at me for being too crazy, and I laugh at them for not being able to see through it. Xiao Hua was truly at his wit's end. He smiled bitterly in his heart. Originally, I thought others were idiots, and I had already seen through it. But unfortunately, I was the idiot, and others had already seen through it. This 13th layer of qi refining cultivation method was placed in the Imperial Thunder sect, yet no one cultivated it. I don't believe that with so many capable people, not a single one of them could see through it. Even if they didn't know about the meridians in the entire body, how could they not know if a foundation establishment master explained it to them? Why didn't they cultivate it? Wasn't it because of the balance between yin and yang? Wasn't it because the qi refining cultivation method on Xiaoyu continent only had the 12th layer? Perhaps there were also people who tried, but all of them fell. But, in the end, I'm different from them. I seem to remember that this qi refining cultivation method originally had the 18th layer. In order to find my origin, I could only. Ayo, it seems. Thinking of this, Xiao Hua's heart suddenly moved, and a bright light flashed in his mind. Since the current suction force is different, the root of the difference lies in the two meridians. Since this young master knows about the meridians in the entire body, why can't this young master create a meridian that is similar to the meridians in qi refining after the foundation establishment meridians? Xiao Hua immediately thought of the meridians in the entire body that he saw when he was dual cultivating with Fairy Hongxia, but Xiao Hua hesitated again. I don't have a method to refine the meridians in the future. That's right, different meridians, different cultivation stages, require different refining methods. Xiaoyu continent doesn't have a so-called universal cultivation method, and even the water attribute and fire attribute physiques cultivation methods are different. Although Xiao Hua knew the location of the meridians, without the corresponding refining method, it was also useless. It seemed that he had reached the end of his rope again. Xiao Hua was somewhat impatient, but within his dantian, the two lightning cores were still revolving, emitting hissing lightning. That light purple thing slightly swayed, and the suction force within was still increasing. This is really going to kill me. Xiao Hua really wanted to stop condensing his core right now. If it was someone else, perhaps they would really be able to stop. On Xiaoyu continent, cultivators who were stuck at this stage were as numerous as carps crossing the river. One more Xiao Hua didn't count as anything. But what was worse was that the two lightning cores were constantly revolving, emitting lightning. Xiao Hua was simply powerless to stop it, and the suction force that was tearing his dantian only became stronger, not stronger. Xiao Hua himself didn't know whether or not his dantian would be torn apart by this suction force in the end. Xiao Hua's primordial spirit, which was comprehending the primordial spirit sword controlling technique, didn't have time to continue comprehending, and hurriedly flipped through the many cultivation methods that he had comprehended before. Earth attribute, water attribute, fire attribute, qi refining, foundation establishment, gold core. Xiao Hua had collected a lot of cultivation methods, and the meridians involved were also not few. But unfortunately, there wasn't a foundation establishment cultivation method that required meridians. Suddenly, a crazy idea emerged in his mind. Create a cultivation method. -11. Chapter 2688. A self-created cultivation technique? Thinking of this outrageous idea, Xiao Hua bitterly smiled. Every cultivation method was a summary of their own cultivation process by a senior with an extremely profound cultivation base, exploring a path that no one had ever set foot on before from the height they stood on. And these seniors were at least nascent soul cultivators, right? So much so that the cultivation techniques created by the senior experts, after their creation, had gone through many years of analysis and modification by many capable people before they finally took shape and could be practiced by low-level cultivator. Xiao Hua's current cultivation base was only at the late foundation establishment stage, yet he still wanted to create a cultivation technique for foundation establishment cultivators. This was simply an impossible matter. Normally, even if Xiao Hua was beaten to death, he still wouldn't think in this direction. Even if he was really asked to do so, he definitely wouldn't do it. Perhaps he would only smile lightly and say, "Let's leave this matter to those with outstanding talent to worry about. It's better for us commoners to tuck our tails between our legs." But at this moment, the situation was so dangerous. At the juncture of life and death, how could there be any elegance? Perhaps only in this kind of critical moment could a person's potential be stimulated, allowing them to see divine abilities that they normally couldn't see. Seeing the suction force tearing at his dantian and distorting it, Xiao Hua stepped into a desperate situation. The idea of creating a cultivation technique gave him a glimmer of hope. With only a slight hesitation, Xiao Hua stepped into a domain that he had never thought of before. I've previously practiced the dragon transformation art, so I'm extremely familiar with the meridians in my body. In terms of the path of discovering the meridians, it's 100 times better than those masters who don't know the meridians. In addition, the key at this time is to balance the yin and yang suction forces. It's not necessary to cultivate from the early foundation establishment stage to the late foundation establishment stage. I only need to open up my meridians. It's not necessary to refine my true essence. Also, I have many cultivation techniques here. Even if I don't know how to create a cultivation technique, it's not necessarily impossible to succeed as long as I follow along. Furthermore, I usually practice the dragonization art as well. The tenacity of my meridians is incomparable to that of others. When I'm developing and refining my meridians, I can correct any abnormalities as soon as I notice them. There might not be any mistakes. Lastly, there is an extremely large amount of metal attribute spiritual energy of heaven and earth in the sword tomb, and there is also an extremely abundant amount of sword qi. Furthermore, I obtained the secret art of transforming sword qi into true yuan from the Yu family, so I don't have to worry about absorbing the spiritual energy of the heavens and earth. The more Xiao Hua thought about it, the more he felt that there was a glimmer of hope in front of him. Immediately, his heart was filled with incomparable faith. In this world, there will always be a first cultivation technique. This first cultivation technique might not necessarily be the work of a nascent soul or spirit-severing stage senior, since there was someone who could make such an earth-shattering move and create a cultivation world in this world. If that's the case, why can't this young master step on the shoulders of the predecessors and create a simple foundation-building technique? With such determination, and in this extremely dangerous place, Xiao Hua actually made an astonishing move. He sat down cross-legged and closed his eyes with difficulty, enduring the heart-wrenching pain. The cultivation techniques that he had seen before flashed through his mind, and he tried to find some incantations to refine his meridians. At the same time, The dragonization art also stopped under the control of the other Yuan spirit. That Yuan spirit also gathered at the new meridians and carefully examined the effects of the incantations. At the same time, Xiao Hua controlled Sai Yinding to open a gap in the Buddhist gold formation, allowing the metal attribute spiritual energy of heaven and earth and sword chi of the sword tomb to pour in. The heavenly infusion technique in his body was activated again, and the metal attribute spiritual energy of heaven and earth and sword chi quickly poured into his body, rushing into the meridians that Xiao Hua was preparing to open. As he tried the incantations one by one, strands of true chi were refined, and strands of true essence were produced with great difficulty. Needless to say, almost all of the existing incantations were useless. Xiao Hua slowly tried to modify individual details according to the meridian's perception. Once the meridians were smooth, the refinement of true chi would immediately proceed. If the details were not satisfied, Xiao Hua would have no choice but to figure out a new incantation according to the previous incantations, and then use this incantation to refine the spiritual energy. Time passed slowly like this. In this irreversible time, Xiao Hua was racing against time, trying to create a new cultivation technique before the gravitational imbalance collapsed, and to balance the power. Fortunately, Xiao Hua's Yuan spirit was very strong, and in this short period of time, he was able to pay attention to many details. When the first strand of true chi was produced in the new meridians, Xiao Hua's heart had already calmed down, and the originally extremely unbearable tearing also gradually weakened. Looking at the Buddhist gold formation where Xiao Hua was, a huge vortex was slowly forming. Xiao Hua was evolving a cultivation technique from the early stage of foundation establishment to the late stage of foundation establishment, and the amount of spiritual energy required was enormous. Although there were large crystals in the range of several hundred li, those crystals were the celestial phenomenon of core condensation, and would not be affected by Xiao Hua's cultivation at this time. Catch a tilde in the high sky, fine golden heavenly lightning was suspended, from time to time rolling and brewing, but it did not fall for a long time. In the sword tomb where 10,000 lightning bolts were not born, the rich gold chi that had accumulated for many years was slowly being defeated by the might of the heavenly lightning. Countless vengeful spirits were fleeing in the midst of the heavenly lightning, trying their best to escape from the shroud of the heavenly lightning. However, this heavenly lightning had an endless suction force, and although it was extremely far away from the vengeful spirits, those vengeful spirits were unable to escape. This was the gold chi that had been defeated by the heavenly lightning, and a huge amount of sword chi was slowly flowing in the sword tomb. The vortex above the Buddhist gold formation was so large that a lot of spirit chi and sword chi inevitably fell into it, and as more and more spirit chi and sword chi flowed in, it formed a torrent that entered the sea. How could Xiao Hua know that he was already changing the current situation of the sword tomb? He was only immersed in the tranquility of creating a cultivation technique. The huge amount of spirit chi and sword chi was absorbed into his body by the immortal body-filling technique. The spirit chi flowed into his meridians, and the sword chi was once again transformed into spirit chi by the falling gold mountain's secret technique. Following the spirit chi, it flowed into his meridians, and within his meridians, this spirit chi was just in time for Xiao Hua to try out the newly created cultivation technique chant. It was absolutely impossible to practice the entire cultivation technique before the suction force tore his dantian and body apart. But under Xiao Hua's attempts, new meridians were gradually being opened, and the yin-yang suction force also had a place to go. The huge difference between the yin and yang suction forces was gradually being changed. Moreover, this change was extremely slow in the beginning, but later on, it became faster and faster. This was the same as when Xiao Hua was creating a cultivation technique. In the beginning, it was admittedly unfamiliar and at a loss. But with failure and success, he gradually grasped the knack of it, and the speed at which the cultivation technique chant was being produced became faster and faster. After an unknown amount of time, perhaps several hours, perhaps several days, when Xiao Hua finally practiced the last chant, Xiao Hua calmly opened his eyes. His eyes were filled with incomparable confidence and incomparable calmness. He slightly sensed it and let out a sigh of relief, secretly thinking that he was lucky. In fact, when Xiao Hua was creating the cultivation technique, he had neglected another crucial point, and that was that the 12th layer of qi refining was equivalent to the 3rd layer of foundation establishment. Xiao Hua's 18th layer of qi refining was only 6 layers more than the 12th layer of qi refining. If he were to create the meridians of the 3rd layer of foundation establishment, then, wouldn't the yin-yang suction force be greater than the yin-yang suction force? Wouldn't that cause another imbalance? This problem was also something that Xiao Hua realized in the middle of creating the cultivation technique. But at that time, how could Xiao Hua retreat? He could only brace himself and force his way through. Perhaps it was the effect of the Phoenix Jade Talisman, or perhaps Xiao Hua only focused on opening his meridians and did not thoroughly refine his true essence. This time, a balance was formed. Naturally, in this balance, there was no longer any pain, only a trace of fetters, like a fishbone in his throat. After all, Xiao Hua's newly opened meridians were not completely opened. Xiao Hua's lips curled into a smile as he muttered to himself, "This cultivation technique should be my Fortune Gate's first foundation establishment cultivation technique. Even, it's a rare cultivation technique for the metal element physique." However, after the joy, Xiao Hua was bewildered again. In fact, it had only been a few days since the beginning of the creation of the cultivation method. In such a short period of time, how could it be so smooth? Even if he was really talented and could create his own cultivation technique, how could opening meridians and refining his true essence be something that could be done in a short period of time? Xiao Hua was prepared to risk his life to delay the core condensation process for several weeks or even several months. To be able to succeed in a few days was definitely not what he had imagined. Could it be, my meridians don't need to be expanded? Only need to be able to refine my true essence. Could it be that when I cultivate the dragon transformation art? Xiao Hua couldn't help but have some doubts. Forget it, this is a good thing, and now is not the time to investigate. I'll think about it when I don't need to open my meridians. Thinking of this, Xiao Hua activated his newly created cultivation technique. Streams of majestic true essence condensed into true essence and rushed towards the final barrier. Boom! A faint muffled sound rang out, as if a wall had been pushed down. The two attractive forces in Xiao Hua's dantian suddenly became incomparably balanced, and the true essence in Xiao Hua's meridians became still at the same time. The two attractive forces of yin and yang blended together like water and milk, and all the large crystals in the cage involuntarily trembled. Xiao Hua understood that this was the best time to condense the core as mentioned in the Zhenqing Jade Slip. Without thinking, he slapped his hand and took out a dozen dry separation pills from the space and was about to put them into his mouth. But at this time, a vigorous sword qi rushed into his body, and the already stopped heaven and man body bestowment technique was once again attacked by a large amount of metal element heaven and earth spiritual energy. Xiao Hua's body involuntarily trembled. -11. Chapter 2689. Oh! Ah! Xiao Hua was slightly stunned. His divine sense swept over, and he was immediately frightened by the huge vortex above his head. Without thinking, he hurriedly urged the seeing cauldron to close the gap in the Brahma gold array. However, the almost endless sword qi and spiritual energy followed the previous trajectory and directly poured in. Xiao Hua simply couldn't close the Brahma gold array under the impact of the sword qi that was stronger than a waterfall. He couldn't even stop the sword qi from rushing into his body. The endless stream of sword qi and metal qi was like a torrential river and sea. Xiao Hua's back was covered in cold sweat. It was really one wave after another. Each wave was higher than the one before. If Xiao Hua was careless, he would fall in this wave. Withdraw. Xiao Hua shook his hand and took out the yin-yang sword gourd that was previously stored in the space. He urged the sword gourd to move. The endless metal qi, sword qi, and sword qi continuously rushed into the sword gourd. However, in the time it took to drink a cup of tea, the sword gourd emitted a green and red brilliance. Xiao Hua understood that the yin-yang sword gourd couldn't absorb anymore, so he hurriedly put the sword gourd back into the space. Forget it, this young master. Xiao Hua smiled bitterly. He was once again forced into a corner, once again tied to a pirate ship. First drink poison to quench thirst, then we'll talk. For a moment, Xiao Hua could only activate the dragon transformation art, agitating all the meridians in his body. The 2 sets of yin and yang meridians heart sutras were displayed. The heavenly infusion technique drew in an endless stream of heaven and earth spirit energy, refining the true energy in his meridians and forming true essence. Rumble. As Xiao Hua urged the dragon transformation art, a burst of muffled thunder sounded. It seemed to be in Xiao Hua's ears, but it also seemed to be in Xiao Hua's body. The power of heavenly thunder was born from the surroundings, slowly imprisoning Xiao Hua. Ah! Lightning tribulation again. Xiao Hua felt the familiar feeling of lightning tribulation when he first entered the Foundation establishment realm. He couldn't help but be shocked and deeply bitterly smile. Forget it, it's like this anyway. Then let's do it together. Thinking of this, Xiao Hua simply ignored the lightning tribulation. He only focused on the sword chi that was poured in. As for the sword chi that was poured in, Xiao Hua didn't dare to use a secret technique to convert it into true chi. However, he had long since comprehended and modified the Falling Gold Mountain secret technique, which allowed him to directly transform the sword chi into sword origin. Since there was a steady stream of sword essence being produced, Xiao Hua very naturally flipped through the sword techniques for sword cultivation. He opened his mouth and spat out 2 flying swords, cheerfully flying around Xiao Hua. Starting from the most basic part, he started cultivating bit by bit. The strands of sword essence condensed by Xiao Hua rushed out of the sword technique in his hand, as if chasing after the 2 flying swords. They formed circle after circle of mysterious sword essence around Xiao Hua's body. Inside the sword tomb, with Xiao Hua's Buddhist gold great array as the center, the sword chi and spirit chi formed a hurricane. This hurricane was like a tidal wave crashing against the shore, surging towards Xiao Hua. As time passed, this hurricane grew larger and larger, and the area it affected also increased. At the edge of the sword catacomb, as if it had sensed the phenomenon of Xiao Hua condensing his core, all of the purple jasmine flowers bloomed. Among the bright purple petals, a blood-colored fruit was revealed. This blood-colored fruit was so bright that it reflected the rising sun outside the dense dark clouds, emitting a faint light. Outside the sword tomb, the scattered cultivators of the Dao sect and the sword cultivators of the Huan kingdom, as well as the disciples of the cultivation clans who had come to the vicinity of the sword tomb in search of opportunities, were all shocked by the sudden appearance of this strange phenomenon. All of them had shock on their faces as they looked at the faintly visible lightning flashing above the sword tomb. They knew that something important must have happened for there to be a strange phenomenon in the sword tomb that was devoid of lightning. Perhaps, it's time for the cultivation war to come to an end. Everyone had this thought, but the Dao sect cultivators who were trapped in the 4-direction sword formation did not think so. Even the sword region swordsmen who set up the formation did not think so. LV Ruochang and the other 3rd-grade illusory swordsmen had already arrived near the spirit-devouring Great Array. They had already reorganized the Huan country's swordsmen into a new Great Array. However, because the spirit chi of heaven and earth in the sword tomb was confined by the phenomenon of Xiao Hua condensing his golden core, although the spirit chi of heaven and earth outside the range of the golden core was constantly flowing into the sword formation, this spirit chi of heaven and earth was once again sucked in by the suction vortex formed by Xiao Hua earlier. Therefore, there was not much spirit chi in the sword formation for the swordsmen and cultivators to use. LV Ruochang and the other sword cultivators wanted to attack, but they were powerless. The swordsmen could not use their flying swords to attack the cultivators. On the other hand, the cultivators wanted to escape, but they were surrounded by the swordsmen and were powerless to do so. Moreover, LV Ruochang and the other 3rd-grade illusory swordsmen were injured. Although Heng Ming and the other middle-stage gold core cultivators were weaker than them, they had spirit talismans in their hands. Although the spirit talismans were not as powerful as before in the hands of Heng Ming and the others, they were more than enough to protect themselves. Therefore, the sword cultivators and cultivators were temporarily in a stalemate, each looking forward to the situation turning around. In the blink of an eye, a few days had passed. Although it was only a few days, it was an earth-shaking change for Xiao Hua. Xiao Hua's sword principle cultivation had been there for a long time. He had been comprehending the sword playing the world for a long time, but he had not had the opportunity to advance further. As for the flying sword technique of the Huan country's sword cultivators, Xiao Hua had been comprehending it since he obtained Li Shoubai and Immortal Brightsword's Jade Slips. The Dream Slayer and Mountain Splitter were excellent proof. It could be said that Xiao Hua's comprehension and cultivation of sword principle had reached a very high level. However, because Xiao Hua did not have time, he did not condense sword essence. After arriving at Sentry City, he knew that the Dao sect had a unique method of detecting sword essence, so he did not dare to act rashly. But now, he had obtained the Changbai sect's secret technique and the secret technique to directly transform sword qi into sword essence. At this time, it was really a matter of course for him to cultivate the flying sword principle. To put it simply, Xiao Hua's sword path cultivation was like a pond. It had been dug out long ago, but no water had been let in, so it couldn't form a beautiful scenery. Now, after a long drought, the rain came from the sky and filled the pond with water. The pond was like a bright pearl, a beautiful scene indeed. Seeing that the vital essence in his body was becoming more condensed and pure, and the sword essence was flowing smoothly in his body like a river of stars, Xiao Hua's mouth unconsciously hung a smile. Of course, at the same time, he had some doubts in his heart. Xiao Hua did not know that his physical body was formed from the flesh and blood of the demonic phoenix, and this flesh and blood had been infiltrated by the chaotic qi. He only knew that his physical body was strange, and that all magic treasures could not fuse with his body, which was very different from other cultivators. However, the sword essence of this sword cultivator could circulate in his body and outside his meridians, which surprised him a little. Unexpectedly, he also discovered that although the sword origin was flowing freely in his body, it seemed to have some connection with the location of his middle dantian. However, Xiao Hua's middle dantian was sealed. He could only make some guesses based on the trajectory of the sword origin. However, when Xiao Hua's gaze fell on the flying dream executioner and mountain splitter, there was a bitter smile on his face. Although these two flying swords flew according to the trajectory of the sword essence outside his body, they could only fly outside and could not fuse with his body. There was extreme helplessness in his joy. Maybe it's because of this. Xiao Hua muttered in his heart, this young master's sword essence is so tough that it has already reached the illusory sword realm, but sword intent has not appeared. Since there is no sword intent, then this young master does not need to temper at all, which is why I can rush to such a realm in such a short time. This kind of secret technique to absorb sword qi, presumably the sword cultivators of the Huan country also know. But why don't they have so many illusory swords? I'm afraid it's the same as the Dao sect's cultivation. It has to be done step by step. The cultivation of a sword cultivator, on one hand, strengthens the primordial spirit brand in the sword spirit, and on the other hand, tempers one's own sword intent. This refining of sword essence is actually inferior. With only sword essence and no sword intent, one cannot enter the illusory sword or even transform it into a sword. I'm afraid, no one will simply absorb sword qi in the sword tomb like this young master. Of course, this young master is also helpless. If I don't absorb sword qi, won't this young master be swollen to death by this sword qi? Xiao Hua immediately found an excuse for himself. However, after reaching this point, this young master has once again reached the end. This sword qi, fragmented sword intent, and the spiritual energy of heaven and earth are still endlessly pouring in. Although the sword origin looks incomparably pure, there is no sword intent of my own within it. All sorts of mottled and fragmented sword origin fill it. How can I enter the sword transformation stage? Looking at the situation around him and the situation of the Buddhist gold formation, Xiao Hua was at his wits' end again. Things did not go as he expected, that there would be a mistake in the process of refining sword essence. The sword qi that was pouring in and wanted to destroy him would unexpectedly stop. Everything was the same as before, moving according to the trajectory. The inertia of this trajectory was so great that it was like a celestial phenomenon. Even the power of the heavenly lightning had imprisoned him, making it impossible for him to stop even if he wanted to. This young master's death is probably coming. Xiao Hua was a little sad, This sword tomb is not only the grave of thousands of flying swords, but also the grave of thousands of swordsmen and cultivators. This young master is also going to turn into a purple flower. Thinking of the meaning of the sword tomb, Xiao Hua naturally thought of the enlightenment he had when he first arrived at the sword tomb. These flying swords were broken here and laid to rest here. This is the final destination of their bravery in the past. Just like the countless brave swordsmen and cultivators, no matter what reason they fought, they did their duty and did what they should do. Their corpses are laid to rest here, so this place should be respected by all living beings, not destroyed and harass. Yes, these broken swords have already understood this life. Let this sword tomb be famous throughout the world. Although this young master's name is not known by others, whether it is the terrifying phoenix or that fleeting nameless, I'm afraid that my name will go down in history. Even the phenomenon of this young master condensing his Dan in the sword tomb today will spread out. This young master is also a person whose name will shake the world, and also a sword that will rather break than bend. -11. Chapter 2690. Thinking of this, Xiao Hua's heart was filled with determination. That unbending tenacity was also transmitted to the sword essence. Clang! Clang! Two loud sword cries came from the dream executioner and mountain splitter. The two flying swords shook violently. Green and red sword lights were unusually dazzling. Even the sword essence inside and outside of Xiao Hua's body was violently boiling. Xiao Hua was stunned for a moment before he suddenly laughed towards the sky. Ha 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 tilde ha 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 tilde. That laughter was extremely joyous and bold. The ancients said that if you hear it in the morning, you will die at night. This life is enough. I didn't think that I would comprehend sword intent in this desperate situation. Sword intent, sword intent, it is the intent of flying swords. What is a flying sword? Sword. 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 Swords are flying swords. Only swords are true sword intent. There are many sword intents among sword cultivators. Whether it's mountains, flowing water, flying flowers, snowflakes, giant wolves, or even flying phoenixes, they all use all things in the world to explain the essence of flying swords. They all use all things in the world to explain the true meaning of flying sword. Could it be a deviation? Could it be that they are neglecting the essentials? They have really forgotten that only swords would rather break than bend. A sword that stands between heaven and earth with benevolence, heart, truth, and emotions. A sword that does not fear evil, does not fear evil, does not fear wind, does not fear rain, is the true sword intent. Along with Xiao Hua's lamentation, even ghost cultivator Huang Yi's tens of thousands of years of grief and comprehension were integrated into his comprehension. The dream executioner and mountain splitter slowly stopped following Xiao Hua's comprehension. A fist-sized heart slowly emerged from the sword light. Then, this heart-shaped sword light suddenly expanded, transforming into a small sword several feet long. The dream executioner and mountain splitter merged into the heart sword. Moreover, the heart sword slowly expanded, and the refined sword essence rushed into it. As the heart sword expanded, the sword intent actually penetrated the confinement of Xiao Hua's core and the lightning tribulation's confinement outside of the Buddhist gold great array. Wang tilde wang tilde wang tilde. Waves of sword cries came from Xiao Hua's body, outside of his body, and even outside of the Buddhist gold great array. It was as if 10,000 swords were bowing down. All the broken swords and sword intents were bowing in front of this sword within the sword. Good. Xiao Hua's body also began to flicker with sword light. Within the sword light, Xiao Hua's body also began to show signs of transforming into a sword. Seeing this, Xiao Hua couldn't help but be overjoyed, and thought to himself, if I can transform into a sword, I should be able to escape the confinement of this phenomenon. Rumble tilde. There was a muffled sound of thunder, and the power of heavenly thunder suddenly rose. Although the sword light around Xiao Hua's body didn't dissipate, his body returned to its original state, and he didn't even touch a hair that had transformed into a sword. What can I do? Xiao Hua laughed bitterly in his heart. I'm afraid it's still because the sword intent and sword spirit can't fuse into the sword heart. Actually, Xiao Hua was still wrong. Not to mention that he was currently in the middle of condensing his core, The celestial phenomenon was shackled, and the lightning tribulation was also hanging in the sky. How could it easily allow him to escape? After all, his body was forged from the flesh and blood of a demonic phoenix, and he had the bloodline of an earth dragon. How could he easily transform into a sword like the others? Ayo, it's still not right. Xiao Hua quickly had another idea. If my cultivation is not high enough, how can I perceive the concept of transforming sword? How can I touch the edge of transforming into a sword? That's right, within this Slayer dream is a split primordial spirit. It's not a projection of the primordial spirit. Xiao Hua suddenly realized, this sword spirit is originally this young master himself, and I don't need to cultivate my primordial spirit like an ordinary swordsman. This young master only needs to strengthen his primordial spirit according to the sword spirit molding method, and it will be very easy to fuse with the sword intent, and very easy to form the sword heart. Damn it, Li Xiaobai, Reverend Brightsword, you two are really too powerful. Thinking of this Xiao suddenly understood the importance of the two's orthodoxy, and suddenly understood why the two didn't want to fight. With this kind of wonderful secret technique, as long as one carefully comprehended it, it would be easier for them to transform into a sword than an ordinary swordsman. Wouldn't the comprehension and research of such a secret skill be more attractive to the two of them than fame and reputation? More than that. When Xiao Hua's gaze fell on the Slayer Dream and Mountain Splitter's heart sword, he murmured again. The heart sword emitted a faint radiance. This radiance was not only green and red, but it was of all kinds of colors. The mottled sword intent within the sword origin had now rushed into the heart sword and transformed into nourishment for the heart sword intent. The sword intent that had rushed into Xiao Hua's body along with the sword light was also attracted by the sword within the sword. Like a myriad of streams returning to their origin, the flying sword slowly expanded, and the Dream Executioner and Mountain Splitter actually faintly showed signs of fusing with it. Wasn't this the sign of the sword spirit and sword intent fusing into one? The sword light flashed, and sword chi soared to the sky. Xiao Hua's heart sword intent was just at the initial stage, growing like a newborn calf, unexpectedly showing signs of breaking through the restriction. Xiao Hua was overjoyed when he saw this. The sword intent was growing strong, wasn't that his hope of breaking through the restriction? However, this joy only lasted for the time it took to brew a cup of tea. The endless sword intent crazily poured in, and the growth of the heart sword had already exceeded Xiao Hua's control. The primordial spirit of the Dream Executioner felt as if it was floating, as if it was infinitely expanding. Xiao Hua could only smile bitterly again. He understood in his heart that he had succeeded in condensing the sword intent, and the sword heart had also taken an embryonic form. However, he had already walked far enough on the path of sword cultivation, and the previous decades of accumulation had been completely exhausted. If the sword intent continued to grow, it would already be out of his control. It might even cause another incessant expansion. Not to mention the Slayer Dream and Mountain Splitter, even everything from before would turn into flowing water. He could only take the sword intent back into his body while he could still control it. It's really like holding a gourd and a ladle floating up. He almost reached out his hand to hold his head. Is this good? Xiao Hua was almost racking his brains. That's right, the tranquil deer sword intent. Xiao Hua immediately thought of Reverend Brightsword's flying sword that he had obtained from the valley. Xiao Hua had previously thought of taking the tranquil deer sword intent for himself, but since he didn't have any sword essence, he could only treat this as a delusion. The tranquil deer sword intent had only been used once to kill Qin Jian, and had never been used again. Perhaps it could be used here? Thinking of this, Xiao Hua quickly took out Reverend Brightsword's flying sword. The moment the flying sword appeared in the air, it immediately let out a sharp sword hum, and at the same time, it let out a resplendent sword light. The sword light was like breathing, and the sword hum was like a challenge. The tranquil deer walked out from the flying sword with the sword light, and its originally tranquil eyes were now filled with a trace of irritation. Matilda the tranquil deer let out a soft cry, and its body shone brightly. As expected, an extremely large amount of sword chi separated from it and flowed into the tranquil deer sword intent, and the tranquil deer's body gradually expanded. Raw Tilda after half a cup of tea's time, the tranquil deer sword intent let out an angry roar, and actually turned into a white tiger, and roared at the heart sword. Clang! Xiao Hua's heart sword intent was not afraid of this at all. With a sword hum, the sound shook the surroundings, scaring the white tiger so much that it trembled slightly. However, the sword origin of the white tiger did not retreat even half a step. Looking at the heart sword and the white tiger confronting each other, Xiao Hua was dumbfounded. He let Reverend Brightsword's sword intent share the burden of the heart sword intent, and not let them fight each other. Quiet as a tranquil deer, moving as a fierce tiger, Reverend Brightsword's sword intent is actually of these two types. It's one level higher than Qin Jian and the others. Xiao Hua sighed, and put away Reverend Brightsword's flying sword. The tranquil deer sword intent also helplessly fell into the flying sword. It's not enough to cause trouble. Forget it, I'll just put away the sword intent. Just as Xiao Hua activated the sword origin and was about to put away the sword intent, he was a little unwilling. His heart moved slightly, and he stretched out his hand, and patted his forehead. The 7 sword pellets refined in the Buddha fire were all taken out. The moment the 7 sword pellets jumped out, they immediately rushed into the heart sword intent, and the sword intent poured into the broken sword pellet like a sweet spring. Good. Xiao Hua smiled again. Let's count it as another way to make up for it. No matter what the outcome is today, this sword pellet can still be repaired. Just as Xiao Hua thought, within the sword intent of the sword within the sword light, sword qi, and sword intent were all incomparably pure. It was the best supplement to repair the sword pellet. Of course, this was also the beauty of Xiao Hua's 9 sword pellets coming from the same source. If it were other sword pellets, this kind of repair would only be incompatible and would conflict with each other. However, Xiao Hua's sword intent was formed from Dream Execution and Mountain Splitter, and the 9 sword pellets complemented each other. Seeing the cracks on the 7 sword pellets healing at a speed visible to the naked eye, Xiao Hua was delighted, but he was also a little scared. He had repaired the sword pellets for so many years, but he couldn't succeed. Looking at this situation, in a short day or even half a day, these 7 sword pellets would probably be completely repaired. From this, it could be seen that the sword qi that poured into the heart sword intent was enormous. If he couldn't control this sword qi, couldn't stop this sword qi from pouring in, then his end would be terrifying. Not only was the sword qi pouring in, at the side of the celestial body empowerment technique, the gold attribute spiritual energy of heaven and earth was still pouring in. Xiao Hua's newly created cultivation technique was still operating at all times. Fortunately, the meridians had just opened, and there was no true essence inside. If Xiao Hua wanted to make up for the homework of the foundation establishment stage, he was afraid that it would take several years, or even more than 10 years. Xiao Hua didn't need to worry about that place for the time being. Sure enough, in less than half a day's time, the 7 sword pellets were repaired one by one according to the order from big to small. All of them were incomparably round and flawless. If it was any other time, Xiao Hua would have already used the sword nurturing technique to project the primordial spirit of dream execution onto these 7 sword pellet. But these 7 sword pellets had just been repaired, and the sword intent began to increase again. Xiao Hua didn't dare to think too much, and hurriedly put the sword pellets back into the Buddha fire, and also put away the sword intent. However, just as the sword pellets fell into the small battle inside the Buddha fire, Xiao Hua was stunned. That damaged small battle inside the Buddha fire didn't give off the same green-red brilliance as the sword pellets. Even after several decades, there wasn't any change at all, like a pine tree biting down on a mountain without letting go. -11. Chapter 2691. This small bucket must be a rare treasure. Xiao Hua's heart moved, and he took out the sword pill and the small bucket together. Maybe it has some use. Xiao Hua had taken out a small bucket. It was completely different from when he had taken out Reverend Brightsword's flying sword and the 7 sword pellets. Everything he had done before had been intentional, and Xiao Hua knew that they would definitely be of some use. But this small bucket. Xiao Hua was purely trying his luck, purely trying it out. He didn't hold any hope. Who would have thought that the flowers planted with the intention would not bloom, but the willow unintentionally would grow? After the small dipper was taken out, there was no reaction at first, but when Xiao Hua raised the small dipper above his head, it was precisely when the sword energy, sword intent, and spiritual energy of heaven and earth poured in. Buzz! A faint, almost inaudible sound came from the small bucket, and all the sword chi, sword intent, and spiritual energy of heaven and earth fell into it, not leaving a single trace behind. Ah! There's no mistake. Xiao Hua almost didn't dare to believe his eyes. It's that simple. How could it be so simple? Who knows, in a while, this small bucket will burst. This young master had better hurry and leave. Xiao Hua almost didn't think, and was about to stand up. Unfortunately, he only moved a little. The celestial phenomenon of condensing the core could be ignored. At worst, Xiao Hua wouldn't condense his core, but the confinement of the heavenly thunder didn't stop because Xiao Hua didn't condense his core. Instead, because of Xiao Hua's movement, Xiao Hua was firmly pressed down, and Xiao Hua couldn't even move. Isn't this forcing me? Xiao Hua naturally thought of that day during the lightning tribulation, when he couldn't struggle at all. I can only face the tribulation. Xiao Hua made a fuss for a long time, and in the end, he still had no choice but to clap his hands, and take out the 9 dry pills again, into his mouth. The dry pills were indeed miraculous. As soon as he took them, along with the overflowing medicinal liquid, the true essence in his meridians solidified, and this solidification appeared in both his yin and yang meridians at the same time. The two solidified true essences, under the effect of 2 balanced suction forces, flowed along his meridians, and headed towards the light purple object in his dantian. Oh! It's actually at the same time? Xiao Hua frowned. He was afraid that there wasn't much true essence in the yang meridians, so he hurriedly moved the small bucket hanging above his head to the side, wanting to let some of the heaven and earth spiritual chi flow down. It was a pity that no matter how Xiao Hua moved, all of the metal attribute heaven and earth spirit chi fell into the small bucket. Not a single strand fell out. Damn it! Why are you even more stingy than this young master? Xiao Hua was somewhat displeased, but at this moment, a hurricane appeared around Xiao Hua's body. Countless large crystals followed the hurricane and rushed towards Xiao Hua. This young master has been fooled by this sword tomb. Xiao Hua almost scolded himself. He had condensed his own core, and the surrounding astronomical phenomena were all prepared for him to condense his core. How could he lack the spiritual energy of heaven and earth? After scolding himself, Xiao Hua did not dare to hesitate. The crystals were pouring in too quickly, and even the dragon transformation art was unable to deal with it. He had no choice but to use both the heavenly body bestowment technique and the dragon transformation art to quickly refine the crystals and send them into his meridian. Xiao Hua even took a break from his busy schedule. Not only did he send the 7 sword orbs in the small bucket into the sword intent of the heart sword, he also took out the yin-yang sword gourd and sent it into the sword intent of the heart sword. The astronomical phenomena were indeed astronomical phenomena. Those large crystals looked very shocking, but they were the purest spiritual energy. When they approached Xiao Hua's body, they immediately shrank rapidly, as if there was a Sumeru array around Xiao Hua's body. They were all absorbed into Xiao Hua's meridians by the heavenly body bestowment technique. Under the dragon transformation art and the mental cultivation method, these crystals were easily refined. Under the effect of the dry pill, they condensed into a solid state and fell into the suction force of the dantian. They followed the meridians and entered the dantian. However, there were so many crystals, and the speed at which they poured in was so fast that Xiao Hua was really tired to deal with them. Hiss, hiss. The yin-yang thunder pill that had been revolving in his dantian once again emitted electric light. The condensed true essence and crystals all fell into the electric light. At the beginning, that light purple object was only a cluster of illusory light. As the true essence and crystals fell in, that illusory light gradually solidified. This solidification was similar to when Xiao Hua was refining pills. Strange runes appeared on it, and these runes flickered with the electric light, constantly overflowing. Immediately afterwards, the purple object trembled slightly. A black and white brilliance flashed, and a needle-shaped sphere visible to the naked eye appeared out of thin air. Following the emergence of this needle-shaped sphere, Xiao Hua's entire body trembled. The brewing heavenly thunder in the sky once again let out a sound, and all the spiritual energy that poured into Xiao Hua's body once again sped up. It's condensing the pill. Xiao Hua had a kind of realization in his heart. However, at this time, his mind was already clear. He didn't think about the lightning tribulation, nor did he care about the sword intent pouring in. Like a machine, according to his own feelings, he sent 9 dry pills into the air to maintain the solidification of his true essence. The dragon transformation art also didn't have any scruples. Ignoring the almost oppressive sound of thunder, it operated at an extremely fast speed, tempering his true essence. One day and night quickly passed. Xiao Hua had taken no less than 600 dry pills, and he was practically taking them non-stop. However, the true essence that was pouring into his body and the true essence still showed no signs of stopping. Is there a mistake? Although Xiao Hua wanted to keep his mind clear, at this time, he couldn't help but jump up and down. When I was building my foundation, I took 360 foundation establishment pills. Now that I've condensed my true essence, don't tell me I have to take 720 dry pills. Looking at the golden core in Xiao Hua's dantian, it was now the size of a fist. Electric light lingered on it, and the 2 thunder cores on the left and right sides slowly rotated, occasionally sending lightning into the golden core. I'm afraid it has something to do with these 2 thunder cores, Xiao Hua inwardly muttered to himself. Because he already knew from Zhen Qing's Jade Strip that late-stage foundation establishment cultivators condensing their golden core was different from qi refining cultivators. There was a process of condensing the golden core, and it was also based on the cultivator's cultivation base. The size of the golden core was determined by the cultivator's true essence, and it took time. A short period of several days, a long period of several months, and even several years. For him to be able to condense his golden core into such a large and perfect size in one day and night, it was definitely unusual. These thunder cores were the most important. But, I'm afraid I don't have many dry pills left. Xiao Hua took a rough look, and secretly complained, if it's 720 pills, it's barely enough. This Yu Qingtian storage pouch actually had 100 or 200 pills. They were his Yu family's many years of accumulation, and they were prepared to leave them for his disciples. I'm afraid these 700 pills won't be enough. That would be terrible. Where should I go to find more pills at this time? As the saying goes, fortune doesn't come in pairs, and misfortune doesn't come alone. Xiao Hua was just thinking about the dry pills when the deafening sound of thunder fell down. Ah! Isn't this forcing me into a dead end again? Xiao Hua already wanted to cry in his heart, but no tears came out. He really didn't understand. It was just a foundation establishment stage, just a core condensation stage. What kind of bullshit thunder tribulation was this? In Zhen Qing's Jade Slip, there was no record of this at all. Fortunately, Xiao Hua had already experienced the baptism of thunder tribulation under the altar in the Flame Forest Swamp, so he could be considered to have some experience. He hurriedly calmed his mind, and slowly released his divine sense. Like a thief walking on tiptoe, he probed the sky outside the Buddhist gold great array. However, his divine sense had only just reached a height of several feet when a strange voice unexpectedly sounded in his mind. This voice was somewhat distant, and also somewhat vague. Xiao Hua was startled. This was the most critical moment for him, so how could there be any mishaps? After Xiao Hua withdrew his divine sense, he pondered for a moment, and felt that this voice didn't seem to belong to Little Yellow. Then who else could it be? That's right, Little White. Xiao Hua suddenly realized, and hurriedly entered the mysterious dark clouds. However, at this time, the mysterious dark clouds were different from usual. The entire dark clouds were no longer flowing like before, and were almost completely stagnant. The soul strands that could easily enter and exit the dark clouds seemed to be imprisoned by thousands of times, extremely obscure. What's going on? Xiao Hua had some doubts in his heart, but he didn't dare to be negligent, and hurriedly entered the heaven ring of aura. As soon as he entered the heaven ring of aura, An incomparably suffocating feeling rushed into his mind. Xiao Hua, is there a thunder tribulation outside? Little White didn't wait for Xiao Hua to speak, and hurriedly asked. Yes, yes. Xiao Hua was actually a bit hesitant. Little White wasn't like Little Yellow, and couldn't be considered to understand too much. He still had some things that he didn't want Little White to know. Quickly send me out, Little White urged. What? You want to undergo thunder tribulation? Xiao Hua was shocked. You're just a soul body, how can you withstand the baptism of heavenly thunder? Moreover, if your soul has condensed, you can, but right now, you're extremely weak. There's no need for the entire thunder tribulation, right? Just a trace of heavenly thunder tribulation can turn you into ashes, right? I've gone through thunder tribulation before. I still have some experience with this thunder tribulation. Little White knew that time was pressing, and couldn't explain too much. He said concisely, my own thunder tribulation definitely won't appear at this time. This thunder tribulation isn't my thunder tribulation, you and I are just spectators. Even if we're affected by the thunder tribulation, we definitely won't suffer too much damage. In addition, the thunder tribulation is a death tribulation, but this death tribulation also breeds life. Haven't you heard of it? Thunder gives birth to all things, and this heavenly thunder is the most fertile. Everything in the world is born from the power of thunder. Oh right, if you want to refine this trace of your primordial spirit into an avatar, it's best to let it go out and undergo thunder tribulation. This is essential. What? This trace of my primordial spirit? Xiao Hua didn't know whether to laugh or cry. How old is he? Won't he be turned into ashes in the thunder tribulation? Listen to me, Little White said, even if this thunder tribulation destroys this trace of your primordial spirit, your mind will only be damaged. What if it succeeds? The mystery in the future, even I can't explain it clearly. -11. Chapter 2692. All right. Seeing Little White so anxious, Xiao Hua didn't dare to be negligent. He hurriedly waved his soul thread, and with great difficulty, he sent Little White Dragon's soul out of the heavenly ring. The confinement of the lightning tribulation was really powerful, it directly penetrated Xiao Hua's soul. To be able to send Little White Dragon out of the heavenly ring, he definitely spent a lot of effort. However, before Little White Dragon came out of the heavenly ring, it said something that almost made Xiao Hua collapse. Besides, you were affected by someone else's lightning tribulation. When I come out, I can also guide you on how to avoid the tribulation. I can guarantee your safety. Damn it, this is my lightning tribulation. Xiao Hua almost wanted to roar. However, there was no need for Xiao Hua to say anything. As soon as Little White came out of the heavenly ring, it was immediately restrained by the heavenly lightning. Looking at the surrounding situation, how could it not know that this was Xiao Hua's own lightning tribulation? Little White was extremely shocked. It really couldn't understand how Xiao Hua, a cultivator from the human realm, could have a demon beast's lightning tribulation. Its entire soul swam a few times in the air with difficulty. It looked at Xiao Hua and originally wanted to ask, but seeing that the lightning tribulation was about to arrive, where was the time to dawdle? However, when it saw tiny dough in the air, its body began to tremble. Roar. The Little White Dragon opened its mouth wide and let out a dragon's roar. Its entire body soared into the air and began to slowly swim around tiny dough. Little White flew up. Xiao Hua was a bit hesitant. Little White's words were a kind of temptation. After the primordial spirit was divided, the growth was slow. If it was really like what Little White said, the primordial spirit could become an independent body, then it was worth a try. Let's do it. How many tribulations can there be in life? Xiao Hua clenched his teeth. Several primordial spirits that could come out were all sent out by him. Naturally, Xiao Hua didn't dare to leave these primordial spirits under the lightning tribulation. That was no different from a naked woman standing in front of a pervert. After Xiao Hua sent these primordial spirits into the heart sword, he released all the soul threads in the heavenly ring. Even the Buddha's Sarira was sent out by Xiao Hua. Xiao Hua really didn't care about the consequences of taking advantage of the situation. After doing all this, Xiao Hua let out a long sigh of relief. He released his divine sense once more, probing the air. Alas, fortunately, Little White Dragon is already so excited that it is wholeheartedly preparing to face the tribulation. If it sees that Xiao Hua actually has so many primordial spirits, I'm afraid it might fall from the sky. At this moment, the sky was filled with dark clouds, and it couldn't get any lower. Although Xiao Hua's spiritual force couldn't completely see through the dark clouds, it was obvious that the range of the dark clouds had already exceeded the size of the last time Xiao Hua built his foundation. Moreover, the black clouds had a dark red color. The dark red color constantly flickered and rapidly surged, as if there was endless thunder water rolling within. Looking at the edge of the black clouds again, there were strands of heavenly lightning that were as thick as a thumb jumping around faintly. Occasionally, there were a few strands of lightning that actually had a kind of bright golden color. This golden color was clearly different from the first lightning tribulation Xiao Hua encountered. Catcher. A sound of thunder flashed from where Xiao Hua's spiritual force was probing. It was as if the building was overturned, and a series of sounds spread in all directions, stretching for more than 100 li, that incomparably oppressive, incomparably solemn, and even incomparably terrifying heavenly lightnings might had already enveloped the entire Buddhist gold great array, and within 100 li of this might was within this might. Alas, today's lightning tribulation seems to have come a bit early. After Xiao Hua's spiritual force probed out, he immediately withdrew it, fearing that he would be hit by the lightning tribulation. When he built his foundation for the first time, the lightning tribulation descended following the completion of his foundation. Although Xiao Hua was somewhat caught unprepared, it wasn't to the point of being flustered. But now, there was still a small amount of true essence in his meridians that hadn't solidified. The golden core in his dantian was admittedly the size of a fist, but in reality, it wasn't complete. Now that the lightning tribulation struck down, what do you think Xiao Hua should deal with first? Feeling that the heavenly lightning's might was even fiercer than the previous heavenly lightning's might, the remaining true essence in Xiao Hua's body began to gradually solidify, and could no longer freely flow. Moreover, with a rumbling sound, a burst of silent thunder resounded in his heart, and a burst of indescribable fear emerged from Xiao Hua's heart. Xiao Hua understood that the lightning tribulation had already begun. Immediately, everything around him and even within his body couldn't move. He could only rely on his physical body to welcome the lightning tribulation. At this moment, Xiao Hua suddenly quivered. Damn it, my true essence has already solidified. Why can't this young master take advantage of this moment to condense his golden core? Thinking of this, Xiao Hua waved his hand, and no longer cared about the number of 9, he took out the remaining dry distance pills, and threw them all into his mouth. Catcher! A series of oppressive sounds of heavenly thunder resounded, and a thread of lightning, as thick as a thumb, sparkled with golden light, was born from the dark clouds, and directly fell down. When that lightning fell on the Buddhist gold great array, it suddenly sprinkled down, and unexpectedly turned into a golden lightning net. That Buddhist gold great array was like snow that met with boiling water, and instantly disappeared. The lightning net fell down, and a part of it fell on Xiao Hua's body, and another part fell on Xiao Hua's soul, and even more fell on Xiao Hua's body. That kind of indescribable pain was born in Xiao Hua's body. Xiao Hua really wanted to throw his primordial spirit into space to avoid this kind of discomfort, but at this time, his primordial spirit was firmly controlled within his body, and it was simply impossible for him to move. Moreover, after this kind of indescribable pain, an even more intense pain drowned Xiao Hua like a tide. Needless to say, this pain came from the primordial spirit within the heart sword. Although Xiao Hua's willpower was firm, in front of this kind of pain that was 10 times more painful, he was still on the verge of fainting. Damn it, little white dragon. Xiao Hua really regretted that he was too soft, too greedy. Last time, when this young master faced the lightning tribulation, I still had the phoenix celestial body to resist it, but this time, Xiao Hua was in pain, and he unconsciously thought of the celestial body he lost. At this moment, his body was filled with golden lightning, and his body was instantly torn apart. However, At the same time, the 132 million tiny dots flickered with lightning, flickering in and out of existence. Occasionally, they would undergo nirvanic rebirth, and the fleshly body would instantly heal. Naturally, the lightning tribulation this time was the same as before. Not only did it penetrate his body, it also penetrated deep into his meridians. His already orange bones were covered with lightning, and those lightning threads quickly swam above Xiaohua's bones. Not only was the majority of the blood threads that were torn out of his body absorbed by his bones, but the lightning threads also penetrated into his bones, and the orange color on his bones increased. The blood threads that didn't have time to be absorbed by his bones slowly fell, entering his meridians and dantian. Within his meridians, under the operation of the dragon transformation art, the meridians that were also torn apart by the lightning were constantly being reconstructed, as if a crazy dragon was waiting to be reborn. Within his meridians, the true origin that had yet to solidify quickly solidified under the effect of the heaven separation pill. Moreover, because of the lingering lightning, these true origin condensed into lumps and rushed into his dantian under the push of the lightning. But the strange thing was, these lumps were different from the true origin that was sucked into the gold core before. They couldn't fuse with the gold core from before, but instead closely followed the male and female lightning cores, circling around the fist-sized gold core. As for the lightning threads that followed the meridians into his dantian, they were once again attracted by the male and female lightning cores and rushed into them. Boom tilde tilde, two crisp sounds rang out, and the male and female lightning cores were actually smashed into pieces. However, at this time, there was a little bit of blood in his dantian, and those blood threads were not afraid of the lightning. The blood threads penetrated into the lightning core, and at the same time, the lightning core rotated and slowly solidified. The dragon transformation art within Xiaohua's meridians was like a coiling dragon, and under the small battle in midair, the soul of the little white dragon was a real coiling dragon. But when the lightning came down, the little white dragon's soul was immediately destroyed by the terrifying lightning tribulation as soon as it came in contact with the lightning thread. However, the remaining little white dragon, which was only the size of a little finger, was once again surrounded by lightning threads, and seemed to have more vitality. The entire soul emitted a strange fluctuation, and threads of silver light seeped out from the small battle, landing on the little white dragon's soul, and the soul actually solidified within the lightning thread. Looking at the Buddha's sarira, it was also somewhat different from the lightning tribulation from before. The entire sarira was also first shattered by the incomparably sharp lightning, and then slowly regenerated on the lotus seat of the Buddha's sarira, solidifying bit by bit. The regenerated Buddha's sarira was clearly repaired in many places, and the color of the Buddha's sarira was also much brighter. Next to the Buddha's sarira, the sword intent of the heart sword also flashed with lightning. This lightning scattered the heart sword in an instant, but after the heart sword was scattered, the benevolent heart did not disappear, and a faint heart-shaped sword image flashed with lightning, enveloping the dream executor, mountain splitter, and the 7 sword orbs. Even the 2 flying swords and the 7 sword orbs were also surrounded by lightning. Xiaohua's pitiful primordial spirit and the soul threads that stretched out from the heaven ring disappeared in an instant under the lightning tribulation, almost like the sunlight shining through the darkness. However, at the place where the primordial spirit disappeared, an extremely faint, almost undetectable fluctuation suddenly appeared the moment the primordial spirit disappeared. This fluctuation followed the flickering of the lightning threads to the place where the soul threads disappeared, and then followed the traces of the soul threads into the Law Eye's soul mark, and rushed into the mysterious dark cloud. The mysterious dark cloud's location changed even more. The entire dark cloud trembled violently, and countless lightning flashed within, rumbling loudly. It was almost comparable to the lightning tribulation that wreaked havoc on the sword tomb. The fluctuation that entered the mysterious dark cloud rushed inside, and the entire dark cloud swelled. Then, lightning flashed in all directions, and the fluctuation returned with the lightning. After passing through the soul threads flashed with brilliance and gradually took shape. After passing through the soul marks in the Law Eye's soul marks also trembled rapidly, and with this trembling, the Law Eye on Xiaohua's left hand also responded. However, Xiaohua did not notice this change at this time. When the fluctuation returned to the place where the primordial spirit disappeared in the heartsword, the fluctuation became even calmer. A dot of black and white appeared from the fluctuation, and with the appearance of the black and white, lightning immediately rushed over, unceasingly attacking the newly born primordial spirit. Lightning birthed all things, it was indeed so. -11. Chapter 2693. Looking at the benevolent heart again, it only slightly surged a few times, just like a heartbeat. Then, within the flickering lightning, it slowly formed the sword intent of the heart sword. Within the sword intent, in addition to the sword light, there was also lightning. Xiao Hua really felt like a year. Although this lightning tribulation did not cause any threat to his life, that kind of stinging pain and itchiness made Xiao Hua feel like death was better than living. Xiao Hua's divine sense could not leave his body, so he naturally could not see the situation of the small bucket above his head. Although he already knew that the small bucket was a strange object, he still underestimated the power of this small bucket. The mottled sword chi, the broken sword intent, and the extremely tyrannical gold attribute spiritual energy of heaven and earth fell into the small bucket like a whale swallowing water. The small bucket's body actually did not change at all. Only under the lightning of the 3 gold lightning tribulation did the lightning threads that fell into the small bucket have a slight reaction. Moreover, the small bucket's damaged areas had some small repairs. Following the repair of the small bucket under the lightning tribulation, there was actually some extremely pure gold attribute spiritual energy of heaven and earth leaking out from the small bucket's damaged areas. This gold attribute spiritual energy of heaven and earth was different from the silver-white color that entered the little white dragon's soul. It directly poured into the top of Xiao Hua's head, and when this spiritual energy entered Xiao Hua's body, part of it entered his flesh, part of it entered his meridians, and even part of it rushed into his dantian. In his dantian, there was still the solid true essence and lightning revolving around the golden core, but there were more and more solid objects. This solid true essence was like an even smaller golden core, like a small sphere revolving around the golden core, according to a mysterious orbit. This orbit was actually somewhat similar to the heavenly Tao starry sky. The small bucket's gold chi rushed into his dantian, part of it adhered to the golden core, part of it adhered to other solid objects, and there was more and more. The remaining part of it wandered around the golden core and solid true essence. After an unknown amount of time, the movement in Xiao Hua's body became smaller, and the pain and all kinds of other feelings slowly lessened. Xiao Hua let out a long sigh of relief, and secretly said, "It's finally over." Thinking of this, Xiao Hua prepared to take a look at the situation of his core condensation. But just as he was using inner sight, he didn't see anything clearly. Kachacha. A golden thread of lightning that was a bit thicker than before struck down again. "Still, do you want me to live?" Xiao Hua's body was being suppressed to death, and he was practically roaring in his heart. That's right. Since there was a second heavenly thunder, who knew if there would be a third? Who knew if there would be a fourth? Xiao Hua's flesh and blood had been torn to shreds. His recovery speed was already somewhat unable to keep up with the tearing speed. His meridians were also in a heart-tearing and lung-splitting pain. Who knows whether or not the next few bolts of heavenly lightning would directly take Xiao Hua's life. Reincarnation after reincarnation, what was the point of suffering for millions of years? Xiao Hua endured another wave of pain, as if he was thinking of Huang Yi's bone-deep sorrow. The pitiful Xiao Hua was using the body of a cultivator to resist the third gold lightning tribulation of a demonic beast. He was probably the most miserable person on the Dawn Rain continent. However, he was not the only one in the Sword Catacomb who was in such a miserable state. Spirit-devouring Great Formation could no longer be called Spirit-devouring Great Formation. Under the disturbance of Xiao Hua's core condensation celestial phenomenon, those spirit-devouring bugs that didn't care whether they were real or fake all pounced on the pure crystal, and most of the real spirit-devouring bugs were killed by the Jindan cultivator's talismans. When the pagoda exploded, those spirit-devouring bugs were even more out of control. No matter how many sword cultivators urged them, those spirit-devouring bugs ignored them. LV Ruochang and the others had no choice but to rush to the sword formation, preparing to use the sword formation formed by the swordsmen to fight against the cultivators. However, under the influence of Xiao Hua, there was no spiritual qi of heaven and earth in this sword formation. No matter whether it was the swordsmen or the cultivators, they had no way to borrow strength and had to fall into a helpless stalemate. They all wanted to wait for the celestial phenomenon to end before making a decision. However, the development of the matter once again exceeded the expectations of the middle-stage Jindan cultivators and the third-grade illusory swordsmen. When the terrifying gold nature spiritual qi of heaven and earth was instantly absorbed by Xiao Hua, the spiritual qi of heaven and earth that came from afar didn't stop in the sword formation. Instead, it formed a bigger hurricane and rolled to the west. Not only that, LV Ruochang and the others were extremely sensitive to the fact that not only the gold nature spiritual qi of heaven and earth was like this, but the sword qi and the broken sword rain were also swept away. What the hell is going on? LV Ruochang really didn't understand. She only knew that the sword qi and sword essence in this sword tomb had no special benefits for the breeding and tempering of flying swords. What did a cultivator need these things for when he was pregnant? A few days later, things once again shocked LV Ruochang and the others. It was once again far beyond what they had seen and heard. In the sword tomb where there was no lightning, thunder rolled in the sky. Although there was the heavenly thunder, it didn't affect the sword qi and spiritual qi in the sword tomb. In the end, the dark clouds pressed down. Although the heavenly thunder didn't strike down in a large area, only 3 thunder tribulations, under the dark clouds, more spiritual qi, more sword qi, and more sword essence were disturbed. The whole sword tomb was already unstable. After tens of thousands of years, or even hundreds of thousands of years of accumulation, it was gradually collapsing. This was not the most important thing. What was worse was that under the heavenly thunder, there was a strange small battle. That small battle was used by Xiao Hua to resist the spiritual qi and sword qi pouring in. At this time, the small battle had changed from passive to active. It continuously absorbed the spiritual qi, sword qi, and sword essence disturbed by the heavenly thunder, adding fuel to the fire. As a result, everything in the sword tomb was affected. The remaining magic array and sword array around the Buddhist gold array were the first to be affected. Traces of spiritual qi and sword qi were sucked out gradually until the entire sword array and magic array collapsed and was sucked into the suction force. Then came the 10-direction annihilation array, which swept away all the spiritual qi and sword qi within dozens of miles. Then came the 4-direction sword array, and the magic array and sword array outside the 4-direction sword array. In the end, the purple jasmine flowers at the edge of the sword tomb rushed into the air. The sky was filled with purple, mixed with spots of blood-red mottled, and rushed to the center of the sword tomb. Outside the sword tomb, the wind was also raging. All the swordsmen and cultivators were fleeing in panic. Even outside the sword tomb, the situation was like this. What could LV Ruochang, whose magic array was already destroyed, do? Although the momentum absorbed by the small battle was very large, it was still ineffective against cultivators and swordsmen. However, in this fierce wind, LV Ruochang was like a defeated hen. Her face was pale, and she looked at the countless sword intents rolling up various celestial phenomena in the air in a daze, making the final performance. LV Jianyu. Ruo Ling was also greatly disappointed. She whispered, "We are not lucky, but it's nothing." No. LV Ruochang bit his lips and waved his hand. Even if there is such a strong celestial phenomenon, but this is definitely not something that a pregnant cultivator can have. Let's get ready. Once the celestial phenomenon ends, we will immediately surround and kill the cultivators. I don't believe that just these hundreds of thousands of cultivators can't be killed by our hundreds of thousands of swordsmen. Yes, we understand. When the surrounding swordsmen saw LV Ruochang's persistence, they could only force themselves to answer. At this point in the battle between cultivators, the result, was it really that important? Catch a tilde when the third heavenly lightning came down like a lightning net, Xiao Hua wanted to howl miserably. The power of the heavenly lightning was getting fiercer and fiercer each time. Not to mention Xiao Hua's pain, The few traces of blood that seeped out were now slowly dripping down along the surface of his body. However, it was also thanks to Xiao Hua's primordial spirit. Not only did he painstakingly cultivate the bone tempering technique, he also painstakingly cultivated the body tempering technique. Furthermore, he also had the dragon transformation art circulating at all times. I can't let the fourth heavenly lightning come. Xiao Hua clenched his teeth and endured the changes in his body. He prayed in his heart, after this heavenly lightning tribulation, I will definitely put more effort in these aspects in the future. When I become pregnant, the heavenly lightning tribulation will be even more shocking. Although Xiao Hua suffered a lot, he also benefited a lot. Not to mention that his physical body, meridians, and bones improved greatly under the heavenly lightning tribulation. Even the Buddha's relic was reconstructed under the heavenly lightning tribulation. Except for the part that Xiao Hua didn't cultivate, the rest were all solid. However, the strange thing was that there were countless vengeful spirits in the sword tomb. These vengeful spirits were also absorbed by Xiao Dou, and not a single one was left out. Xiao Hua originally wanted to expiate a few of them and improve the cultivation of the Buddha's relic, but his wishful thinking was in vain. After the heavenly lightning tribulation, little white dragon's soul was really too small. It couldn't be compared to before the heavenly lightning tribulation, but the difference was like heaven and earth. They couldn't be compared at all. However, the sword intent that Xiao Hua placed outside was not affected by Xiao Dou. Even when the 3 gold heavenly lightning tribulation struck it, the heart sword didn't show any signs of collapse. Instead, it became stronger under the heavenly lightning tribulation. Not only was there lightning on the surface, there were also countless tiny electric sparks flowing inside. This electric sparks not only flowed through the flying sword, sword pill, primordial spirit, and soul strands, but also seeped into the yin-yang sword gourd. The heart sword intent was like this, but it wasn't much. Xiao Hua's Jindan had changed even more. Now, Xiao Hua's Jindan was already the size of 2 fists. Moreover, the 2 thunder pills and the solid true essence from before were already gone. It was completely a complete Jindan. However, under the silver brilliance of this Jindan, the first Jindan that was condensed was already intact. The mysterious runes on the surface were naturally formed. The solid true essence from before had now turned into countless silver granules. These silver granules had traces of lightning on the surface. They were like stars revolving around the Jindan in the middle. The 2 thunder pills from before were now much bigger. From time to time, lightning would still be produced from them and fly towards the Jindan in the middle. -11. Chapter 2694. The strangest thing was that between the golden core, lightning core, and granules, there were a lot of silver things. These things were like clouds, in the shape of silk. They were scattered all over the gaps without any pattern. The lightning threads could easily pass through them without being affected at all. This kind of strange golden core, even if he saw it with his own eyes, he wouldn't dare to believe it. He would definitely be happy and angry at Xiao Hua for making things so complicated. Even the condensation of the golden core was a mess. It was unprecedentedly bizarre. Not to mention the condensation of the golden core. When Xiao Hua was building his foundation, he created a gimmick of the 18th level of qi condensation, delaying the date of building his foundation for many years. Only now, when he truly condensed his golden core, did the hidden danger of the 18th level of qi condensation reveal itself. It was really because he encountered a special environment like the sword tomb that he was able to pass through this hidden danger. It was really unknown what kind of earth-shattering thing Xiao Hua would do when he was pregnant with a golden core like this. Yes, it really was an earth-shattering thing. When Xiao Hua passed the 3rd tribulation lightning, his body, which had suffered very little damage, seemed to have been cut into pieces by 1,000 blades. The surface layer was dripping with blood. Most of the blood threads were absorbed back into his body when his body healed after the lightning tribulation. However, there were still some blood threads that dripped down, directly passing through the remnants of the Buddhist gold great array and seeping into the ground of the sword tomb. However, at this time, the sword tomb, Could it still be called a sword tomb? Roar tilde a dragon roar came from the little white dragon's mouth. This roar was extremely loud, and it actually had the momentum to shake the surroundings. It was very obvious that it was completely different from before the lightning tribulation. Xiao Hua tilde quickly send me back. I want to meditate, don't disturb me. Carefully savor the harvest of the lightning tribulation. After the dragon roar, the little white dragon cried out weakly. Okay. Xiao Hua didn't say anything, but he muttered in his heart, it's already like this, and you're still trying to show off. What are you shouting for? Thinking of this, Xiao Hua sent out his soul strands to entangle the little white dragon. Xiao Hua originally thought that his soul strands, which had undergone the lightning tribulation, would be able to easily send the little white dragon into the heavenly ring. In the end, the little white dragon's soul had become much heavier. He still had to expend a tremendous amount of effort to complete this task. Naturally, when Xiao Hua sent the little white dragon into the heavenly ring, the several primordial spirits within the heart sword all returned to their original position. Following which, Xiao Hua followed the little white dragon's instructions and began to carefully comprehend it. Xiao Hua closed his eyes and sat cross-legged high up in the sky. The Buddhist golden array had been broken and his figure had long since been revealed. However, he didn't move. While he was carefully comprehending the feeling of condensing his core and the thunder tribulation, he was also inspecting his body, meridians, bones, and other changes. After the time it takes for an incense stick to burn, Xiao Hua opened his eyes. His face was filled with joy, but at the same time, he was frowning slightly. Strange, where did the 2 lightning cores in my dantian go? Could it be that because of the lightning tribulation, it fused with this young master's golden core? Xiao Hua was somewhat puzzled. But if that's the case, then what about this young master's lightning drawing technique? Thinking of this, Xiao Hua stretched out his hand and used the lightning drawing technique. At this time, above Xiao Hua's head, although the thunder tribulation had already passed, the dark clouds didn't dissipate so quickly. If it were any other time, once Xiao Hua's spell was cast, 10,000 bolts of lightning would have already descended. But this time, his thunder drawing technique actually failed. Damn it, there really is a problem. Xiao Hua was somewhat disappointed. Looking at the slowly dissipating dark clouds, he was unhappy. This young master's meridians seem to have undergone earth-shaking changes. The tempering of my bones has also reached 99%. Even the strength of my body has greatly changed after the lightning tribulation. But this young master is a terrifying phoenix. Without the lightning drawing technique, this young master can only be a bald man. Alas, this golden core seems to be not small. It's even bigger than the golden core cultivators that this young master killed before. Thinking of this, Xiao Hua's body suddenly bloomed with golden light. It was the protective golden light of ordinary golden core cultivators. Go tilde Xiao Hua waved his hand and a fireball flew out. Boom tilde with a loud sound, flames soared into the sky within a range of several dozen jong. He tilde Xiao Hua's heart was filled with a trace of joy. The method of controlling true essence of a jindan is indeed very different from that of a foundation building. Not only is the magic power several times stronger, even the speed is also much faster. Moreover, with this golden core, even in a situation where there is no spiritual energy of heaven and earth, I can still use great magic. Yee! What is this? As far as Xiao Hua's eyes could see, there were actually more than a dozen fist-sized spirit-swallowing bugs flying around. One of them rushed towards the place where Xiao Hua's fireball was just now, the others were wandering around nearby, and there were even 2 that rushed towards Xiao Hua. These are spirit-swallowing bugs. Xiao Hua's heart was suddenly filled with joy. He had seen spirit-swallowing bugs in the sword slip before. Why are there spirit-swallowing bugs here? Oh, I reckon that Xiao Do sucked them here. Thinking of this, Xiao Hua waved his daoist robe, and the space of several jong was imprisoned. These spirit-swallowing bugs couldn't move at all. Xiao Hua then put them all into his sword pouch. Hee, the heaven and earth sleeve technique has also improved. Yee, this is. Xiao Hua's heart was filled with joy again. He released his divine sense, wanting to see if there was anything else that he had missed. However, when he released his divine sense, he saw the purple jasmine flowers sweeping through the sky and the specks of blood spots in the purple sea. He couldn't help but be shocked. Aren't the purple jasmine flowers at the edge of the sword tomb? Could it be? Could it be? Xiao Hua almost jumped up from the ground where he was sitting cross-legged. He looked at Xiao Dou above his head in disbelief. Since Xiao Dou had undergone the thunder tribulation, there had been no pure gold spiritual chi of heaven and earth left behind. Moreover, the damaged part seemed to have been repaired now. Could it be this thing? Xiao Hua thought and hurriedly released his divine sense. When his divine sense really saw the situation outside the Buddhist gold formation, he opened his mouth even wider. Yes, above the dark clouds, the sun had already appeared. The golden sunlight was sprinkling down, and it looked like the wind was blowing. It was noon. The sword formation, the magic formation, the accumulated sword essence, had long disappeared. How is this possible? The sword tomb is thousands of miles wide. Xiao Hua's mind raced. Although he already knew that since the purple jasmine flowers at the edge of the sword tomb had been sucked here by Xiao Dou, and the unique gloominess of the sword tomb had disappeared, this fact already proved that Xiao Hua's guess was true. However, he still denied this guess in his heart. After all, this was really too big. Thinking about this, Xiao Hua probed again and released his divine sense. His divine sense was no longer restricted by the sword tomb, and in an instant, it stretched out for nearly 100 miles. Oh! Why are there so many Dao sect cultivators here? When Xiao Hua's divine sense swept past the previous location of the 10-direction annihilation formation, he was surprised to find that there were actually many Dao sect disciples here. These disciples were wearing the robes of various sects and looked panicked. When did my Dao sect disciples come to the sword tomb? Xiao Hua was somewhat baffled. But why haven't I seen the sword cultivators of the Huan country? Xiao Hua's divine sense immediately attracted the attention of the Dao sect disciples. Many disciples released their divine senses and swept toward Xiao Hua's direction. However, these disciples' divine senses only swept out 100 feet before they were immediately awakened and hurriedly withdrew their divine senses. Wasn't the divine sense coming from the direction of the pregnant Dao sect master? Wasn't it calm now because the pregnant Dao sect master had successfully stepped into the nascent soul stage and released her divine sense? Which disciple didn't want to live and look for trouble? There are disciples from various sects, and there are even disciples from the Imperial Thunder sect. Xiao Hua was increasingly baffled. Could it be that my Dao sect disciples are fighting with sword cultivators in the sword tomb? He was completely confused. Xiao Hua's divine sense swept around, but he didn't see any traces of a great battle. At this time, all the traces had long been swept clean by Xiao Dou, so how could he still find any clues? Xiao Hua hurriedly withdrew his divine sense and released his Buddhist sense. His Buddhist sense was released for a distance of over 200 miles, and Xiao Hua finally saw some Dao sect disciples fleeing in panic. This is bad. Sure enough, the battle has started. Xiao Hua suddenly realized. This young master's wife is still there. Thinking about this, Xiao Hua's body flourished with sword light. The heart sword standing in midair let out a sword cry and transformed into 2 flying swords, 7 sword pills, and a sword gourd. At the same time that the sword origin returned to his body, Xiao Hua also stored the Dream Executioner, Mountain Splitter, and the 7 sword pills into his Buddhist fire. As for the sword gourd, it was stored into the space. After that, Xiao Hua activated the Scene Cauldron once more and retrieved the damaged Brahma Gold Grand Array. At the eye of the array, 6 fist-sized metal essence orbs were revealed. The Brahma Gold Grand Array was built on the foundation of these 5 metal essence orbs. If it was in the past, Xiao Hua would definitely be happy, but at this time, he only glanced at it and stored it into the space. After Xiao Hua stored away the Buddha Sarira, his gaze once again fell on the mysterious Xiao Dou. The Xiao Dou was still absorbing spiritual energy of heaven and earth, but this spiritual energy was no longer the same as before. It seemed that because it had absorbed enough, or because other than the sword intent, sword energy, and metal essence of heaven and earth in the sword tomb, other spiritual energy of heaven and earth was useless to the Xiao Dou, so the Xiao Dou's absorption of spiritual energy of heaven and earth was much weaker, far less shocking than before. Xiao Hua was somewhat hesitant. Although the momentum had been greatly reduced, the vortex still existed. Xiao Hua was afraid that he would once again fall into the same dangerous situation as before. If so, wouldn't Xiao Hua be looking for trouble for himself? However, if he didn't store away this Xiao Dou, how could Xiao Hua be willing? Even if Xiao Hua didn't know the power of this Xiao Dou, since it had fallen into his hands, he was unwilling to throw it away. Now that he knew that this object was extraordinary, Xiao Hua was even more unwilling to throw it away. Ayo, not good. It seems like there are disciples of the Huan Hua sect. Xiao Hua's Buddhist sense had been outside all this time. When he saw that there were actually disciples of the Huan Hua sect being chased by swordsmen, he couldn't help but feel anxious. He clenched his teeth and urged the Imperial Thunder Travel to fly towards the Xiao Dou. Rumble, rumble, rumble. The sound of a thunderstorm was suddenly heard. It was even louder than the previous Imperial Thunder Travel. -11. Chapter 2695. Imperial Thunder Transformation. Xiao Hua only had a flash of thought in his mind when he instantly flew below Small Dou. Xiao Hua did not even need to raise his hand. As his figure flashed below Small Dou, his mind wrapped around it and Small Dou was sucked into the space. Boom! Countless amounts of world spirit chi followed the inertia and smashed towards the place where Little Dou disappeared. The enormous force was extremely surging as it directly smashed into the ground. A deep pit that was several tens of feet in size instantly appeared. The soil and dust rose high into the air as countless amounts of world spirit chi continued to rush over. Wave after wave of impact rippled and dispersed into the distance. However, this rapid rippling impact could not catch up to Xiao Hua's figure. Xiao Hua's cheerful laughter scattered across the sky. What is going on? Since the inner cores of the male and female lightning beasts have disappeared, how did my lightning escape technique advance again? Xiao Hua kept Small Dou. His heart was carefree and bewildered. Perhaps, it has something to do with the tempering of my physical body. However, just as Xiao Hua thought of this, anger appeared on his face again. He roared like spring thunder, "Who dares to hurt my Dao?" At this point, Xiao Hua realized that this was Li Zongbao's catchphrase. He hurriedly shut his mouth. Thunder rumbled under his feet and his figure suddenly sped up. He did not want to use the lightning escape technique, but in the battle between the sword cultivators and the Dao sect, Fairy Hongxia, Li Zongbao and Xiao Maro were already in a predicament. How could he dare to conceal it? Which bastard dares to hurt my Imperial Thunder sect disciple? Xiao Hua was helpless as he hastily changed his mantra. He used the two secret techniques of stealing the sky, swapping the sun, and crossing the sea by deception. He also took the opportunity to change his Daoist robe and quickly flew forward. As for the location of the spirit-devouring Great Array, because the sword tomb no longer existed, the place where the sword cultivators and the Dao sect confronted each other was still a little turbulent. However, it was already very different from before. Even Xiao Hua could keep Small Dou in such a situation. LV Ruochang, Heng Li, and the rest could naturally fight to the death. Seeing the sky gradually disappear, LV Ruochang saw the outcome she had predicted. Although she was shocked by the disappearance of the sword tomb, she was more concerned about killing the Dao sect cultivators. The sword mound was nothing more than a product of the Great War of Dao and Sword. If this sword mound was gone, another sword mound would definitely appear. As long as they killed these hundreds of thousands of cultivators, the existence of the sword mound would be meaningless. Therefore, as soon as the suction force of the small battle weakened slightly, LV Ruochang personally took action. He urged the sword light to fight with Heng Heng, and the hundreds of thousands of sword cultivators surrounded the hundreds of thousands of cultivators, ready to kill them one by one. Li Zongbao, Xiao Maro, and Fairy Hongxia were all in a critical situation. The three of them had been injured earlier, but after consuming the pills refined by Xiao Hua, their injuries had improved greatly. However, during this period of time, the spiritual chi of heaven and earth had changed, making it impossible for them to cultivate in peace. They had to constantly deal with the harassment of sword cultivators, causing their injuries to drag on and unable to fully recover. This was especially so for Fairy Hongxia. Her phoenix celestial body had been severely injured by the 5-elemental sword qi, and she could no longer summon it. She could only use the carnate true water to protect herself, Xiao Mao and Li Zongbao. Xiao Mao was only in the middle foundation establishment stage, and his dharmic powers had long been depleted. Fortunately, he cultivated the dragonization ability, and when his spiritual qi recovered, he could extract spiritual qi much faster than others. This was why he could fight with Fairy Hongxia. As for Li Zongbao, who had the highest cultivation, now that his immortal piercing whip had been destroyed, he no longer had a suitable dharmic treasure. Most of his mystique was on the immortal piercing whip, and without it, he was really restricted. He could not even compare to Xiao Mao. Clang tilde LV Ruochang's sword light shot into the sky, and the sound of the sword humming could be heard. The phoenix sword will flew out from her body and rushed towards Heng Heng. Heng Heng's face was equally gloomy. He pointed his finger, and the talisman in his nascent soul hand flashed with a faint light, and grabbed at the phoenix sword will. Heng Heng's mood was the complete opposite of LV Ruochang's. He originally wanted to take advantage of the changes in the sword catacomb to find a flaw in the sword cultivators so that he could lead his disciples to escape from the sword formation. But under LV Ruochang's command, the sword cultivator disciples had a tight defense and were impregnable. After several days of stalemate, there was no gap at all. Seeing that the spiritual qi of heaven and earth had become the same as outside the sword catacomb, Heng Heng's heart sank again. Left with no choice, he could only order the Taoist disciples to fight against the sword cultivators, and he himself took out his talisman. If Heng Heng and the others' talismans were normal, they would naturally be able to deal with LV Ruochang and the other third-grade illusory swordsmen. But in the spirit-devouring array, these talismans had been devoured by the spirit-devouring bugs and had been damaged. Now, they were definitely insufficient to deal with the enemy swordsman. After the first contact between the cultivators and the swordsman after the changes, the cultivators were immediately at a disadvantage. But as the cultivators fought, they tried their best to break out of the encirclement towards the west. On one hand, there were disciples guarding the 10-direction annihilation array there. On the other hand, they were still hoping that the nascent soul stage elder who caused the changes in the sword catacomb would suddenly appear. However, after fighting for another half a day, tens of thousands of cultivators were killed. The remaining 100,000 cultivators were exhausted and their morale was low. Their morale was in stark contrast to the hundreds of thousands of swordsmen. Heng Feng and the others were in despair. Roar tilde it sounded like a dragon's roar was coming from afar, but it was much softer when it reached this place. But everyone heard it. Mph, don't think about the nascent soul stage elder. Didn't you hear it? This is the roar of a strange beast, not the nascent soul stage elder of your Taoist sect. LV Ruochang's phoenix sword essence was once again crushed by Heng Heng's nascent soul stage elder. Seeing Heng Heng involuntarily look towards the west, LV Ruochang sneered. Even if you have a nascent soul stage elder helping you, do you think we sword cultivators don't have a sword transformation stage elder? Don't forget, when we first entered the sword catacomb, the sword transformation stage elder's sword essence was also there. Psi tilde that's right. Heng Heng's face turned ashen when LV Ruochang saw through his thoughts. That's right. How could a nascent soul stage cultivator compare to a sword transformation stage elder? Even if this nascent soul stage cultivator was willing to help, would he dare to? Are you really going to kill every single one of my cultivators? Heng Yarrow looked sadly at the cultivators who were fighting hard, especially his own disciples. Under the siege of more than 10 grade 6 brightsword swordsmen and 2 grade 1 illusory swordsmen, Fairy Hongxia, Xiao Mao and Li Zongbao were already in a perilous situation. If not for Fairy Hongxia's innate primordial water, and if not for the fact that these swordsmen were greedy for the innate primordial water, the three of them would have died long ago. What? LV Ruochang sneered. Didn't you all have the same thought when you were in the Golden Destruction formation? If we were in a different situation, would you let the sword domain elders go? Hung Hung gritted his teeth and said fiercely, I don't know if I can be as ruthless as you. However, I know that where it is possible to make mistakes, one should spare them. Even if I fall today, there will come a day when you will be forced into such a desperate situation by my Tao sect's disciples. Ha ha ha. All right, I will wait for that day to come. LV Ruochang laughed and threw away his previous coldness. I'm afraid you will never see that day in your life. At this moment, in the western sky, rolling thunder sounded from afar. The sound of thunder was like the beating of a war drum, crushing the courage of the sword cultivators. It's finally here. Hung Hung was delighted. A nascent soul stage cultivator's aura came from afar, slowly pushing towards them. However, this aura was a little strange. It only flashed across the sword formation before it was retracted. Then, an angry roar sounded. Which bastard dares to hurt my Imperial Thunder Sect disciples? This voice was like a clap of thunder, shaking the hearts of hundreds of thousands of sword cultivators. They could not help but quietly retract their sword light. LV Ruochang felt the aura of a nascent soul stage cultivator and his expression turned cold. He gritted his teeth and the phoenix sword intent that was about to charge towards Hung Hung also stopped in midair. He looked up into the distance. In the distant horizon, where the thunder was rumbling, a powerful divine sense swept over. At the same time, a short figure flew into everyone's vision at a speed faster than rainbow transformation. Senior brother Nameless. Seeing Xiao Hua's appearance after his transformation, Mingyu was the first to cover her mouth and exclaim, Ah! The second to be shocked was Fairy Hongxia. For a moment, she did not understand. Was this Nameless the real Nameless or Xiao Hua's Nameless in disguise? After all, this was the nascent soul stage Nameless. Xiao Hua was far from the nascent soul stage, right? However, although Xiao Hua's spiritual will had undergone a huge change after condensing his core, there was still a trace of familiarity within it. Furthermore, when Xiao Hua had arrived at the scene, he had looked at her with concern. Fairy Hongxia immediately understood. This nascent soul stage senior was none other than her lover, Xiao Hua. Senior brother Nameless. Hung Hung naturally knew Nameless' name. Seeing the rumbling thunder, how could she not know that this was Nameless? She hurriedly called out. But after calling out, she realized that this was Nameless after his pregnancy. He was her senior, so she immediately changed her greeting. Disciple Hung Hung greets Senior Nameless. De Zun, Xiong Huasong and the other surviving Golden Core stage cultivators all bowed and greeted Senior Nameless. Xiao Hua was very pleased with himself. However, he did not really fly close to the battle. Instead, he stood far away in the sky and waved his hand. You all wait. Then, his gaze swept across the entire battlefield. He frowned and said coldly, You all are actually fighting in the Sword Tomb? My Tao sect disciples, other than those from the west, are there only so many left? What about Qian Mo? Senior Nameless should know that Qian Mo had already fallen before coming to the Sword Tomb. Yuan Zhongyu immediately bowed and said, That day, Qian Mo followed me to the clear cave and was forced to self-destruct by this swordsman Lu Ruochang. If not for Qian Mo's sacrifice, I'm afraid all of us would have fallen into Lu Ruochang's trap. -11. Chapter 2696. Qian Mo is dead. Xiao Hua was slightly taken aback, and the image of that righteous golden core cultivator appeared in his mind. That's right, it's LV Ruochang's trap. Heng Ju hurriedly said, she pretended to be weak outside the sword catacomb, and lured our cultivators into the sword catacomb. Furthermore, she set up the yin-yang sword formation, the five-element sword formation, the spirit-devouring formation, and even a soul cultivator formation. She wanted to exterminate hundreds of thousands of our disciples. Exterminate? Xiao Hua really didn't expect LV Ruochang to have so many tricks up her sleeves. Before he participated in the battle, she set up such a huge trap. If he didn't condense his core in the sword catacomb, perhaps, not only him, but also Fairy Hongxia, Li Zongbao, Xiao Mao, and all the other Dao sect disciples would have died in the sword catacomb. Seeing Xiao Hua frown, Heng Ming hurriedly bowed and said, "Fortunately, Senior Wu Ming's pregnant celestial phenomenon broke the sword cultivator's battle and saved our 100,000 disciples." Disciple Heng Ming brings the 100,000 disciples who survived to thank Senior for his great kindness. All the disciples bowed in unison, saying, "Thank you Senior Nameless for your kindness." Obviously, Heng Ju was afraid that Nameless wouldn't make a move, and wanted to use this righteousness, using the lives of the 100,000 disciples to ask Nameless to make a move. However, Nameless was Xiao Hua, and he came to make a move. How could he not make a move? However, how to make a move was another problem for Xiao Hua. "You are LV Ruochang?" Xiao Hua's gaze fell on the female swordsman opposite Heng Ju, who had already regained her indifference. "Junior LV Ruochang greets nascent soul senior." LV Ruochang's tone was cold, but her etiquette was considerate. She bowed and said, "Junior has already heard of Senior's name. Many thanks to Senior for sparing our lives in the Seven Extremes Mountains." "Junior LV Ruo." The other third-grade illusory swordsmen were extremely unwilling, but they also bowed helplessly. This helplessness was the same as when Xiao Hua bowed when he saw the swordsman near the Yin-Yang Twin Springs Mountain. "Ian, you can wait." Xiao Hua waved his hand. "I understand what you mean by waiting. This old man didn't participate in the battle, and now I'm a nascent soul senior, so it's not suitable for me to participate in your battle." Heng Ju's heart grew anxious as he silently complained about how the Imperial Thunder Sect was as pedantic as Qian Mo. He wanted to say something. In fact, Xiao Hua's heart was also full of discomfort. Concealing one's cultivation level and being a foundation establishment cultivator, one could really run amok. But how could he be so restrained after acting like a nascent soul senior? However, do you think that I can just stand by and watch as 100,000 Dao sect disciples die in your ambush? Xiao Hua rolled his eyes and said, "Not to mention that this old man is unable to face the master of the Imperial Thunder Sect, I'm afraid that this old man's future cultivation will also have inner demon. Senior, if you want to interfere, then do your best." Lu Ruochang said coldly, "Senior, you are not the only nascent soul cultivator here. There are also sword transformation masters in our sword domain." "Oh!" Xiao Hua sneered, "Are you threatening this old man?" "It's not a threat, it's a fact." Lu Ruochang wasn't afraid at all. "Since Senior didn't participate in the battle, don't worry too much about it. Your Dao sect's cultivators actually talked about the loss of your sect, but what about the loss of my sword domain? Your Dao sect's cultivators set up the 10-direction annihilation formation in the sword tomb. Didn't they also lure my sword cultivators into an ambush? Didn't they also kill hundreds of thousands of my swordsmen?" "Oh, there's such a thing." Xiao Hua immediately understood the reason why he saw the disciples of the various sects earlier. In short, this is not the time for nascent soul senior and sword transformation senior to appear, and Senior is also not a gold core cultivator who is participating in the battle. Therefore, I hope that Senior can distinguish right from wrong and withdraw as soon as possible. Lu Ruochang said word by word, otherwise, when sword transformation Senior of my sword domain arrives, it will be hard to say anything. How can there be any sword transformation masters in this sword tomb? If there are falling gold mountain cultivators, there are still some. Xiao Hua secretly curled his lips. Senior Nameless, don't listen to her nonsense. Xiong Huasong immediately shouted, before the swordsmen were ambushed, there was indeed a sword transformation master's sword intent at the place where Senior came from, but the swordsmen were killed. There was no trace of sword transformation Senior at all. Oh, I understand. Xiao Hua naturally knew the cause of the matter. The sword transformation master's sword intent was definitely Zhong Yuha's doing. This was what Xiao Hua saw that day. Therefore, Xiao Hua was even more certain that there was absolutely no sword transformation in this sword tomb. Nonsense, if there was a sword transformation in the sword tomb, how could Xiao Hua successfully condense his gold core? Or rather, if the sword transformation was in the sword tomb, could it escape the suction force of small dough? Lu Ruochang. Xiao Hua raised his head and said coldly, "What do you think your sword transformation swordsmen can say when they see this old man? My sword domain's sword transformation senior and Dao sect's nascent soul senior are all seniors in our eyes. No matter if it's a war or a peaceful time, we disciples should respect them." Lu Ruochang said neither arrogantly nor humbly, "As for what seniors say to each other, how would this junior know? Alas, the war between Dao sect and sword cultivators has already lasted for thousands or even tens of thousands of years. The number of swordsmen and cultivators that died in the sword tomb is also unknown. Among them, there is no lack of outstanding talents. If it weren't for the war, they would all be able to prove their Dao." Xiao Hua sighed slightly and had the appearance of an expert. "This old man won't talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the war. The 10-direction annihilation formation swordsmen suffered great losses, the 4-direction sword formation cultivators suffered great losses. Both sides can be considered even. After today, it will be the battlefield of the various senior brothers. You all should know when to stop." Lu Ruochang didn't give in and said indifferently, "My sword domain's sword transformation senior still hasn't appeared. This junior doesn't know if I can stop. Moreover, senior doesn't seem to be a Dao sect disciple participating in the war. You don't seem to have the qualifications to say these words, right?" Xiao Hua frowned and felt very ashamed and angry in his heart. It wasn't that he didn't want to give this Lu Ruochang some color to see, or even take her life. However, he really didn't know what method to use. He didn't know what spell to use, what ability to not reveal his identity. Thinking for a moment, Xiao Hua could only say again, "Right and wrong in the war between Dao cultivators and sword cultivators, no matter what is said, it's useless. You and I are the difference between friend and foe. So much, what's the use? This old man is asking you right now, whether or not you can stop. It's useless." Lu Ruochang also said coldly, "This junior is only reminding senior that nascent soul cultivators and sword transformation cultivators are all seniors. You can't lower yourself to the same level as us juniors. If senior violates this rule, don't blame my sword domain's sword transformation cultivators for attacking foundation establishment and chi condensation cultivators for no reason. As for whether or not I should stop, this junior still has the same words. This junior doesn't have the qualifications to say that I should stop." Ha ha ha. Xiao Hua raised his head and laughed heartily. He pointed his finger and said, "Don't say that there are over 300,000 swordsmen here. Do you think these swordsmen can be my match?" In fact, Lu Ruochang's thoughts were exactly as Xiao Hua thought. She really wanted to use these 300,000 swordsmen to fight Xiao Hua. She firmly believed that Xiao Hua absolutely didn't dare, or perhaps disdained to do such a thing to the drawing sword swordsman. And she absolutely dared to use these 300,000 swordsmen to fight Xiao Hua. However, Lu Ruochang said indifferently, "This junior doesn't dare to think like that. These sword cultivator disciples are just ants in senior's eyes. Senior only needs to stretch out a finger to pinch them to death. Everything depends on senior's thoughts." Nonsense. Xiao Hua was somewhat displeased. He wasn't a nascent soul cultivator and didn't have the awareness and self-restraint of a nascent soul cultivator. He said coldly, "Tell me, my sect's 100,000 disciples, will you release or not release? What if I don't release? What if I release?" Lu Ruochang also threw caution to the wind and said coldly. In fact, Heng Jiao and the others were already anxious. They even disapproved. Why would a nascent soul cultivator talk so much nonsense with illusory swordsmen? Just directly kill them. Although there were 300,000 swordsmen, even if a few escaped, would the Dao sect still admit that it was a nascent soul cultivator? They only needed to kill Lu Ruochang and the other illusory swordsmen. At this time, when they heard Lu Ruochang forcing Xiao Hua into a dead end, they also looked at Xiao Hua anxiously, as if they were waiting for Xiao Hua's decision. Damn it! How could Xiao Hua not know what these gold core cultivators meant? Not to mention that he wasn't a nascent soul cultivator. Even if he was, he still had to consider his own sect. If he killed all the illusory swordsmen, What would happen to the Imperial Thunder Sect? How would Qian Lazy explain to the Huan country's sword cultivators? Release. Naturally, it's good for you, it's good for me, it's good for everyone. Xiao Hua said coldly. If you don't release, then you die. It's not good for me, it's not good for everyone. Xiao Hua was also very ruthless. He now regretted wearing the Imperial Thunder Sect's clothes and appearing as nameless. Then, this junior would rather die. Lu Ruochang's face was pale. His slender eyelashes fluttered slightly, but his eyes were like the moon in the night sky. He stared at Xiao Hua without the slightest fear. You are forcing me, Xiao Hua said word by word. He slapped his forehead. He vaguely remembered the hand of the nascent soul cultivator in the ink-black forest. A huge hurricane appeared, and the surrounding heaven and earth spirit chi condensed around Xiao Hua's body. That aura was not inferior to that of an ordinary nascent soul cultivator. Ever since Xiao Hua created the Foundation Establishment cultivation method, his confidence skyrocketed. He believed that with his cultivation of the heaven and earth sleeve, he could definitely use the hand of the nascent soul. Even if there were any mistakes, he was just a nascent soul cultivator. What was so hard to explain? Seeing the heaven and earth spirit chi within 100 feet being absorbed by Xiao Hua, Ruo Ling and the others' faces changed slightly. Heng Jiao and the others were also happy. As for Fairy Hong Xia, she was a little shocked. The heaven and earth spirit chi condensed rapidly. Xiao Hua slightly spread his robe, and the power of imprisonment enveloped Lu Ruochang for 100 feet. A faint palm mixed with rocks and the others were already beginning to take shape. Senior nameless. Ruo Ling said anxiously. The outcome of the battle has already been decided. Even if Senior kills Junior Sister Lu, what benefit will it bring to the battle? Besides, why should Senior lower himself to the same level as us? Senior, please stay your hand. -11. Chapter 2697. Who said the outcome of the war has already been decided? How come this old man doesn't know? Xiao Hua narrowed his eyes, his tone cold, as if he had already made a decision. He didn't believe that after he killed LV Ruochang and the others, the cultivators of the 3 cultivation countries would sell the Imperial Thunder Sect to the sword cultivators of the Huan country. Hiss. Ruo Ling and the other swordsmen sucked in a breath of cold air, realizing that Xiao Hua was truly angry. It seemed that he was going to interfere with the war with the power of a nascent soul. Zhu Chengye's expression changed slightly, and he almost flew back a few steps, as if preparing to command the swordsman. Looking at LV Ruochang again, she felt even more regretful. Her previous words didn't involve the war, and she only focused Xiao Hua's attention on her. She even wanted to use her own life to exchange for the lives of 100,000 cultivators, but she didn't expect that Xiao Hua didn't care about the bearing of a nascent soul cultivator and wanted to kill her. She had overreached herself. Seeing that Xiao Hua's nascent soul hand was about to form, Xiao Hua's expression became even colder. Ruo Ling and the others unconsciously clenched their fists, preparing to work together to receive the attack of a nascent soul cultivator. But at this moment, whoosh tilde. A long cry of a flying sword came from afar, and a golden light flashed and landed in front of LV Ruochang. A flying sword message? All the sword cultivators were stunned. Because of the special nature of the sword tomb, they couldn't directly use flying swords to send messages. Now that the sword tomb had completely disappeared, a flying sword message could naturally be sent. This was beyond the expectations of all the sword cultivators. However, this flying sword message was right in front of LV Ruochang, and LV Ruochang was restrained by Xiao Hua. Although this restraint wasn't to the extent that LV Ruochang couldn't move, LV Ruochang didn't dare to struggle desperately. Let this old man see, which old sword ghost sent this message. Xiao Hua coldly looked at Lu Ruochang. Without any trace of politeness, he raised his hand and the flying sword message obediently fell into his hand. A small flying sword flew into Xiao Hua's hand. Xiao Hua released his divine sense and immersed it in to take a look. His face unconsciously revealed a look of astonishment. After a few minutes, he flung his hand, and the flying sword landed in front of LV Ruochang. He coldly snorted and said, "LV Ruochang, you're a schemer. Zhenzhen, let me, all of you scram." As he spoke, Xiao Hua loosened the heaven and earth within sleeves technique. His figure flew up slightly, leaving LV Ruochang more than 10 feet away. When Heng Ju saw Xiao Hua's attitude, he couldn't help but be stunned. After Xiao Hua saw the flying sword message, he didn't seem to want to care about this matter anymore. Could it be that this is the swordsman's letter? All the cultivators and swordsmen had the same thought. However, LV Ruochang's face was very indifferent. He took the flying sword letter and looked at it carefully. His face flushed instantly. He raised his head and laughed. His earlier indifference disappeared. Ha ha ha, ha ha ha. So what if this sword falls today? Your Dao sect cultivators have suffered such a crushing defeat. As a nascent soul cultivator, what can you do? A lone tree cannot hold up the sky, isn't that the case? Junior sister Lu Ruo Ling was shocked and hurriedly flew in front of Lu Ruochang to stop her from being overjoyed. Senior sister Ruo Ling, look. LV Ruochang gave the flying sword to Ruo Ling and said, "This sword's wish has been fulfilled. Even if this sword falls here today, this sword can still smile and meet the fallen seniors of the sword region." Ruo Ling picked up the flying sword and looked at it carefully. Her face was also overjoyed, but there was also a trace of realization in this joy. Ruo Ling understood, but everyone else was kept in the dark. They were all confused. Heng Ju, Xiong Huasong and the rest looked at Ruo Ling, then at Xiao Hua. Ruo Ling's joy was needless to say, but Xiao Hua's face was gloomy. Needless to say, the news in this flying sword was definitely bad news to the Dao sect cultivators. But what exactly was the bad news? Could it be more tragic than the destruction of 100,000 cultivators in the sword tomb? Senior Nameless. Ruo Ling didn't pass the flying sword letter to Zhu Chengye and the rest. Instead, she bowed slightly and asked, "Junior, can I tell everyone about this matter? This is a matter of war, it has nothing to do with this old man." Xiao Hua waved his hand and didn't answer. However, he didn't leave either. Clearly, the matter on the flying sword letter had already surpassed this. Heng Ju and the rest felt their hearts skip a beat. They all looked at each other in dismay. They really didn't know what could be more unexpected than this. Let the brave warriors of the sword region know. Ruo Ling cleared her throat and said loudly, under the command of LV Ruochang and fellow swordsman LV Ruochang, Skyscraper Ridge, Soaring Windsword Sect, Swarm of Owls Valley, Mountain Crossing Ridge, Cloud Cave, and other swordsman friends, suddenly attacked the Lian Kingdom. We obtained a major victory. The Lian Kingdom's peaceful shepherd prefecture's Mo family, Shilong City's Jian family, Qingjizi Li family, and other 13 cultivation families, as well as Liu Meng sect and Mount Duckweed, have now fallen into the hands of our sword regent. This news absolutely exceeded everyone's expectations. Not only the Dao sect cultivators, but even the sword cultivators of the Huan Kingdom were shocked. For a moment, everyone was stunned, and the entire battlefield was silent. Wu Tilda immediately after, all the sword cultivators cheered, and all of them were abnormally excited. As for Heng Ju, De Zun, Xiong Huasong, and the rest, their faces were ashen. They never thought that the sword cultivators' true goal was the Lian Kingdom. They really didn't think that the sword cultivators would actually want to open up a territory in the Lian Kingdom. They also never invested too many Dao sect disciples in the Lian Kingdom. Now, this news was tantamount to a bolt from the blue to them. Ruo Ling looked at Lu Ruochang, whose face was deathly pale but whose eyes were filled with joy and whose cheeks were slightly flushed. She really didn't know what to say in her heart. This kind of diversion tactic, this kind of strange arrangement, was really not something she could have guessed. Right now, even if Xiao Hua killed Lu Ruochang, even if he killed 300,000 sword cultivators, the Lian Kingdom wouldn't be able to seize the Lian Kingdom. However, it was impossible for the Dao sect's cultivators to easily seize the territory of the Ripple country. Xiao Hua's actions were of no benefit to the Dao sect's war. It could only incite the anger of the sword domain. Perhaps this anger could only be directed at the Imperial Lightning Sec. Would Xiao Hua do this kind of thing? Xiao Hua naturally wouldn't do it, because he had just said it. All of you, scram. Ruo Ling quietly pulled on Lu Ruochang's sleeve, and didn't say a word, but her gaze already explained her meaning. Although Lu Ruochang bit her lips tightly, and was unwilling in her heart, but she wasn't a fool. Knowing when to stop was the right thing to do. If she stubbornly persisted, she would definitely end up like Qian Mo. Seeing that Lu Ruochang didn't speak, Ruo Ling nodded slightly at Zhu Chengye. Zhu Chengye hurriedly raised his hand and said, "Warriors of the various sword domains, we will return in triumph." As he spoke, he waved his hand and flew to the north of the sword tomb. Naturally, the sword tomb was no longer the same as before, and there was no need for any flying swords to scout the way. The group of sword cultivator disciples puffed out their chests and valiantly flew away with Zhu Chengye. Although Lu Ruochang was extremely unwilling in her heart, she still resentfully left under Ruo Ling and Mu Ting's hand. Xiao Hua sighed, and a sense of helplessness arose in his heart. Yes, he could ambush Qin Jian and Lu Ruochang, but these actions couldn't change the situation of the Dao cultivator war. A cultivator, whether it was Qi refinement, foundation establishment, golden core, or nascent soul, the effect they could play was too little. The reason why a war was called a war was because of the coordination, planning, and scheming. These were not Xiao Hua's forte. Then, Xiao Hua waved his hand, and his figure flew up again. Thunder rumbled around him, and he was about to fly away again. "Senior Nameless!" De Zun hurriedly shouted, "We thank Senior for saving our lives." "There's no need for that." Xiao Hua's interest waned, and he shook his head slightly. "All the heavenly phenomena that broke the sword formation and whatever shocking thunder, they have nothing to do with me. With my cultivation, it's impossible for me to trigger any lightning tribulations. This sword tomb has undergone such a huge change. This is not something that I can do. I just happened to pass by and saw the changes in the sword tomb, so I came to take a look. It's also a fluke that I was able to save all of you. Now that all of you are tired from the war, let's wait for the other senior brothers to come over. Senior, please wait for a moment." Heng Li came to his senses and hurriedly said, "Disciple and the others should also report to Senior about fellow Daoist Qian Mo's deed." "Qian Mo?" Xiao Hua shook his head slightly. He only had a bad impression of Qian Mo, and did not have a trace of good impression of him. He simply did not want to hear about his death. "You all better report to the senior brothers of the Imperial Thundersec." After saying that, Xiao Hua did not stay any longer. Stepping on the shocking thunder, he flew towards Nanfeng. However, his lips moved slightly, as if he was saying something. "Senior." Heng Li opened his mouth, wanting to keep Xiao Hua, but when he saw that Xiao Hua did not pay attention to him, he felt a sense of disappointment and frustration in his heart. "That's right. What's the use of keeping this nascent soul, Senior? Not to mention the great defeat of the Sword Tomb, even in the entire Dao Cultivator War, the cultivators of the Dao sect were also defeated. The faces of the Golden Core cultivators in the conference hall had long been lost. Looking around again, how many of the Golden Core cultivators in the conference hall survived the four directions sword formation of the sword cultivators? Not to mention, among the 27 most famous sects, only 13 cultivators survived, and all of them were injured. The sects that were not famous, most likely had already fallen. The war had reached such a stage, and the cultivators of the Dao sect could be said to have suffered a crushing defeat. "Forget it." Heng Li looked at Xiao Hua's disappearing figure, and the sound of thunder that was getting softer and softer in his ears, and somewhat weakly ordered, "Regroup. We will return to Sky Patrol City." "That's right." De Zun suddenly thought of something, and with a low exclamation, he shut his mouth again. "What's wrong?" Cheng Ming was beside De Zun, and his meridians were also greatly damaged. When he heard De Zun's low exclamation, he asked softly, "Just now, the strange phenomenon in the sword tomb, that faint dragon roar, what's going on?" De Zun lowered his voice and said, "I don't know if it was done by Senior Wu Ming. Also, the sword tomb where 10,000 lightning bolts do not occur, why would there be a lightning tribulation? I have never heard of it before." -11. Chapter 2698. Cheng Ming shook his head slightly, looked at the place where Xiao Hua disappeared, and said, "Didn't Senior Nameless say it just now? It seems that the dark clouds of the lightning tribulation and the disappearance of the sword tomb have nothing to do with him. And this is not something a nascent soul master can do. Senior Nameless came and went in a hurry. I'm afraid he's going to find out the truth of this matter. Otherwise, Lu Ruochang will definitely not be able to keep his life." De Zun nodded slightly, but he was still a little confused. What fellow Cheng said is reasonable, but if it's not Senior Nameless, who in this sword tomb can have such magical power? When did the sword tomb have a strange beast? How can there be a dragon's roar? Who knows if it's a dragon's roar? In short, it might be some strange beast. However, even if it's possible, I don't believe that it's Senior Nameless doing. Cheng Ming was a little disdainful. Didn't you see it just now? Senior Nameless nascent soul technique can't be used perfectly. This sword tomb is thousands of miles wide, with thousands of years of sword energy. Not to mention a nascent soul master, even a spirit severing stage senior can't do it. There must be a big anomaly in the sword tomb. A strange beast is going through the lightning tribulation again, and Senior Nameless is just pregnant. This situation is also our luck. Speaking of this, Cheng Ming smacked his lips, with a look of lingering fear. He lowered his voice again, afraid that the sword cultivators who had already gone far away would hear him. This kind of coincidence can only be believed by those sword cultivators who don't know the details of our Dao sect cultivators' advancement. If not, with Senior Nameless nascent soul cultivation, he might not be able to kill so many third-grade illusory swordsmen. If not, those third-grade illusory swordsmen would have fallen out with Senior Nameless long ago, right? Yes, it should be so. Heng Zhao and the others were very knowledgeable, so they naturally had the same tolerance. But seeing De Zun nod again, he said, "Previously, I was a little worried for Senior John Doe. If it weren't for the flying sword message, you wouldn't have been able to find a way out. If you wanted to save us, you would have to kill LV Ruochang. Once he made his move, Ruo Ling and the other sword cultivators would have no choice but to act. Not to mention that old man, even our lives are in danger. Nameless is indeed a senior from the Imperial Thunder Sect." Yuan Zhongju aside. He and Qian Mo are really similar. Obviously, with his cultivation level, he might not be able to save us. Yet, he refused to give up. If he didn't save us, he wouldn't turn back. He doesn't even take Lu Ruochang's threat seriously. Indeed, Heng Zhao chimed in, "Once we return to Sky Patrol City, the first thing we need to do is to inform the masters of the various sects about the outcome of the war. The second thing is to report the matter of Senior John Doe saving us, so that the teachers can be prepared to assist Senior John Doe at any time. Don't let him be besieged by the swords of Huan country." Not bad. All the Golden Core cultivators nodded. We are indebted to Senior John Doe. We must take responsibility for this matter on behalf of Senior John Doe and the Imperial Thunder Sect. We must not let him and the Imperial Thunder Sect be attacked by the sword. The group of Golden Core cultivators was not in a hurry to fly away. They knew that the sword cultivators had retreated and had achieved an unprecedented victory in Huan country. Lu Ruochang and the others would never do anything unnecessary, and the sword cultivators would never chase after them again. Hence, they urged the remaining 100,000 or so disciples from various sects to fly west and meet up with the other disciples before returning to Sky Patrol City together. The 100,000 disciples' faces were filled with joy, the joy of escaping death. They did not care about the Huan country being attacked by the sword cultivators. In their eyes, as long as they could escape with their lives, it was better than anything else. Moreover, they also knew that as the survivors of the early stage of the sword battle, they were all meritorious. Although they did not know if they had to continue to stay in Sky Patrol City to fight with the swordsmen after the nascent Soul Masters arrived, it was obvious that the Dao sect cultivators were defeated and they were also badly injured. They were not fit to fight again. What they had to do now was to return to Sky Patrol City and meditate first while waiting for the nascent Soul Masters to arrive. Then, they would most likely have to return to their sects with the flying ship. Li Zongbao and Xiao Maro stood in mid-air with a puzzled look on their faces. Xiao Hua's divine thought had become much stronger, so they could not immediately tell that John Doe was Xiao Hua. However, they knew that John Doe first appeared in 7 Extremes Ridge. That was also the time when Xiao Hua went to 7 Extremes Ridge to rescue them. If there was no accident, John Doe should be Xiao Hua. After all, the Imperial Thunder sect would not have so many powerful disciples for no reason. However, whether John Doe was Xiao Hua or not depended on Fairy Hongxia, who was at 7 Extremes Ridge that day. Unfortunately, when Li Zongbao and Xiao Maro looked at Fairy Hongxia, she did not pay them any attention. Her gaze fell on Ming Yu's face, who was not too far away from her. Ming Yu's eyes were filled with surprise, regret, and longing. She was looking in the direction where Xiao Hua had disappeared. It seemed that she had been staring at Xiao Hua and had not been satisfied. It also seemed that her gaze could penetrate space and see Xiao Hua's not very tall figure. For no apparent reason, Fairy Hongxia felt a ripple in her heart. However, a trace of pride appeared at the corner of Fairy Hongxia's mouth. She muttered in her heart, "Husband, what is he doing? When will he be able to conceive a baby? If it's about core formation, it's about the same. And, where did he get such a powerful divine ability to make the sword catacomb disappear? Looks like, when I see him later, I'll have to ask him a few more questions." Fairy Hongxia thought as she flew up with the group of disciples. She inadvertently turned her head to look at the sword catacomb that had become very ordinary. This sword catacomb is no longer the sword catacomb. It will no longer be a dangerous place. Sigh, I'm afraid my country of Xi. Fairy Hongxia flew away. Li Zongbao and Xiao Maro also flew away. Hung Hung and the rest also flew away. Everyone's gaze shifted away from the sword catacomb. In their hearts, they all thought that the sword catacomb would no longer exist. What they didn't know was that under the sword catacomb, an unknown depth, there was an unknown space. Layers of black and red lingered on the surface of the space. A body that was dozens of feet in size was lying on the ground. This body was covered in black gas, making it impossible to see its true appearance. The body was quiet, without any movement. However, the calm and orderly swirling black and red suddenly started to boil. It was as if there was some unforeseen event. The swirling blood emitted a faint fluctuation that slowly spread into the space. The black gas on the body was also disturbed and gradually rippled. The strangest thing was that above this space, some of the blood that dripped down from Xiao Hua's lightning tribulation slowly fell. Although it wasn't directly above this space, it seemed to have some suction force. It slowly changed its direction and fell towards this space, the sword catacomb, an existence that had existed for thousands of years. Now that it had disappeared, who knew what kind of unforeseen event it would cause? A few days later, more than 500 miles to the west of the sword catacomb should be where the purple jasmine flower was. Xiao Hua had already returned to his original appearance. He was slowly flying in the air with a trace of doubt on his face. As he walked, he waved his hand and a thumb-sized lightning easily struck down. It was precisely the lightning that struck a thick ancient tree in the distance. Strange. Xiao Hua whispered to himself. Previously in the sword catacomb, there was no lightning. Now that the sword catacomb is no longer here, why is there no lightning? Could it be that this sword catacomb was originally a little strange? Is it because of this strangeness that the sword catacomb was formed? And it wasn't because of the sword catacomb that it became so strange. Moreover, this young master's lightning attracting technique still exists. Compared to before the core condensation, there isn't any change. Thinking of this, Xiao Hua immersed his divine thought into his dantian, and his hand formed another seal. In his dantian, the 2 fist-sized golden cores emitted a faint brilliance, and a wave of spiritual power gushed out. No, this golden core seems to be a little different from what Martial Uncle Jen Qing said. Xiao Hua looked at the incomparably smooth silver golden core and shook his head. The golden core is born from the heavenly Tao and is somewhat similar to alchemy. There must be some traces of the heavenly Tao inside. Ayo. I understand. Xiao Hua's divine sense easily penetrated the golden core and entered the inner layer of the silver brilliance. In an instant, he saw the true core of the golden core, as well as the lightning core and many planet-like true essence particles. The heavenly Tao starry sky? Xiao Hua looked at the constantly rotating sphere and the silver clouds and unconsciously groaned. Others bitterly search for the heavenly Tao starry sky. Even Daoist Yang Hong of the Haoming City is proud of the Shen Kong Pavilion's starry sky. However, this young master's golden core actually has this thing. This. Xiao Hua smiled bitterly. Now that he knew the disadvantages of mutation, he was really worried about the effects of the heavenly Tao starry sky's golden core when he was pregnant. Forget it. Don't think about it anymore. One wrong step and all wrong steps. All the karma had already been planted when this young master built his foundation. What's the use of thinking about it now? It's better to cultivate more, look for more secret techniques, and make more preparations for the pregnancy. Xiao Hua shook his head and smiled. As the saying goes, when the water comes, the earth will cover it. When the soldiers come, the soldiers will block them. This young master wants to see what kind of scenery it will be like when I'm pregnant. After thinking about it, Xiao Hua raised his head and looked into the distance. He felt strange and said, "My wife, why isn't she here yet? Could it be that something happened to the sword tomb? This place is only a few hundred miles away from the sword tomb." As he spoke, Xiao Hua released his divine sense. Then, a smile appeared on his face again. This girl doesn't miss her husband at all? This kind of dawdling, doesn't she know the principle that a long separation makes the heart grow fonder? Sure enough, in the time it took to finish a meal, Fairy Hong Xia's graceful figure appeared in midair in the distance. She released her divine thought, and the moment she saw Xiao Hua, she immediately increased her flying speed. Like a phoenix returning to its nest, she rushed over. 11. You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.